In the early months of 1942, the Pacific belonged to Japan. From the smoke-filled ruins of Pearl Harbor to the jungles of Malaya, the Imperial Japanese Navy moved like a tide no one could stop, precise, ruthless, unstoppable. Every sunrise brought a new report of conquest: Hong Kong fallen, Singapore surrendered, the Philippines under siege. The rising sun flag fluttered over islands and harbors that had never known it before. The world watched in awe and fear. For half a century, Western powers had dismissed Japan as a small, disciplined nation mimicking the tools of empire. But now, those same empires were crumbling beneath Japanese aircraft and guns. The British fleet had been driven from the South China Sea. The Dutch East Indies burned. The once proud American fleet at Pearl Harbor lay in ruins, its battleships sunken, its pride drowned in smoke and oil. Across the Pacific, the illusion of invincibility settled over the Imperial Japanese Navy. Its admirals believed they were witnessing destiny, the realization of a divine plan. The empire, long contained by treaties and racial arrogance, now stood unchallenged. They called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, but beneath the polished slogans lay something older, darker, the hunger for domination disguised as liberation. At the center of this storm stood one man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Brilliant, cultured, and haunted by foreknowledge, Yamamoto had orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor, a blow meant not to provoke, but to paralyze. He knew America's strength, its vast industry, its capacity to fight when angered. He had studied at Harvard, traveled through the United States, and seen its potential firsthand. But even he believed that if Japan could destroy America's fleet early, it might buy enough time to secure its empire, before the sleeping giant fully awoke. Pearl Harbor had been that first, daring stroke. And it had worked. In the following weeks, the Japanese struck everywhere at once, a symphony of violence across 10 million square miles of ocean. The American garrisons in Guam and Wake Island fell. Manila burned. In the Dutch East Indies, oil fields, the lifeblood of Japan's war machine, were seized. To the north, in the cold waters near Singapore, Japanese aircraft sank the British battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse in a single afternoon, proving that even the Great Royal Navy could bleed. The world had never seen naval warfare like this before, swift, airborne, and merciless. The carrier had become the new capital ship, and Japan wielded it with surgical precision. By February, Tokyo newspapers were filled with headlines proclaiming divine favor. Radio broadcasts declared the Pacific a Japanese lake. Schoolchildren in Kyoto and Osaka cheered for the war that would end Western arrogance. Even the cautious generals of the army began to believe in the myth of their own invulnerability. But not Yamamoto. He had won too easily, too cleanly. He understood that every victory brought Japan closer to the one enemy it could not defeat, time. He saw the industrial might of America beginning to awaken. He knew that every bomb dropped on Pearl Harbor had united a divided people. In Tokyo, others celebrated conquest. Yamamoto quietly calculated consequences. "I fear," he said to his staff, "that all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Still, the tide of triumph rolled on. In April 1942, Japan's empire stretched farther than even Yamamoto had imagined. From Burma to the Solomon Islands, its reach was absolute. The Imperial Navy's fleet, the Kido Butai, remained undefeated, its carriers prowling the Pacific like predators. No enemy had yet stood against them and survived. The pilots who had once strafed Pearl Harbor were now seasoned veterans, their discipline as sharp as their steel. In Washington, the United States reeled. The Navy that had ruled the Pacific since the end of World War I was crippled. Battleships, once the pride of American power, lay twisted at the bottom of Pearl Harbor's harbor floor. The Pacific Fleet, under the calm but resolute Admiral Chester Nimitz, struggled to regroup. Shipyards on the West Coast roared day and night, building new carriers and planes faster than ever before. But for now, the U.S. was fighting to survive, not to win. Still, amid the wreckage, something stirred, a stubborn flame of defiance. America was wounded, but it was not broken. As the Japanese advanced deeper into the Pacific, the U.S. Navy began to strike back in small ways, a carrier raid here, a submarine ambush there. These actions changed nothing strategically, but they reminded both sides that the war was not over. The Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April 1942, though symbolic, was a dagger to the heart of Japan's confidence. Civilians heard air raid sirens for the first time. For a nation that had believed itself untouchable, the illusion began to flicker. Yamamoto understood what that flicker meant. Pride had blinded his peers, they saw victory everywhere. But Yamamoto saw the shadow that always followed it. He knew that if Japan did not destroy America's carriers soon, completely and irreversibly, the balance of power would shift forever. And so, in his study aboard the flagship Yamato, the admiral began to plan a new operation. A strike so decisive it would erase America's chance to recover, a battle that would lure the U.S. fleet into the open, annihilate it, and end the war before it could truly begin. The name of his target was Midway Atoll, a small ring of coral halfway between Asia and America, isolated and seemingly insignificant. But to Yamamoto, it was the perfect bait. As the final details of his plan took shape, Japan stood at the very peak of its power. Its fleets sailed unchallenged, its armies advanced without resistance, its people believed in destiny. From the emperor's palace to the farthest island garrison, confidence ruled like a fever. But the tide, though high, was already beginning to turn. Far away in Honolulu, inside a nondescript gray building at Pearl Harbor, a team of American cryptanalysts was listening, patiently, quietly, decoding fragments of Japanese radio traffic. They did not know it yet, but their work would change the course of the war. For now, the rising sun burned bright over the Pacific, and the world held its breath. The age of Japanese dominance had reached its zenith. And like every tide, it was about to fall. The morning of December 7th, 1941, did not end when the fires at Pearl Harbor were extinguished. It lingered, in the smoke-stained skies above Oahu, in the twisted wrecks of battleships that lay half-submerged like coffins, and in the hearts of millions of Americans who had watched their illusion of safety shatter in a single, brutal dawn. The attack had lasted just 2 hours. Yet in that short span, America had changed forever. Across the Pacific, the harbors were silent but for the groan of metal cooling in the sun. USS Arizona, still burning, entombed over 1,000 sailors within its hull. Oil slicks covered the water, black and shimmering, spreading like grief itself. The air reeked of fuel and death. And from that black water rose something Japan had not anticipated, not fear, not retreat, but resolve. The nation that had slept now awoke in fury. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt prepared to speak to Congress. His voice was calm, but beneath its steadiness burned anger sharpened into clarity. Yesterday, he said, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the chamber was silent at first, and then thunderous. Within minutes, the United States was at war. But the war America entered was not the war it had prepared for. The Pacific Fleet, once the pride of American power, lay crippled. Battleships that symbolized national might were now tombs beneath the sea. Naval aviation, still considered secondary to heavy ships, suddenly became the only surviving weapon capable of striking back. In that moment of crisis, a new kind of leader stepped forward, quiet, deliberate, unshakable, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. Appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet just weeks after the attack, Nimitz inherited chaos, and with it, the burden of resurrection. The docks were still scorched, morale still broken. Yet he walked among the wrecks of Pearl Harbor with the calm of a man who saw beyond the ruin. Where others saw a graveyard, he saw the foundation of something new. The Japanese did us a favor, he told his officers. They spared the dry docks. They spared the fuel tanks. They spared the carriers. The carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Yorktown, Saratoga, had been at sea during the attack, spared by fortune and timing. They would become the cornerstone of America's vengeance. Across the country, factories that had once built automobiles and refrigerators began producing tanks, planes, and ships. The industrial awakening Roosevelt had promised years earlier now roared to life. Women filled assembly lines, riveting steel for aircraft and ships. Men lined up to enlist, driven not by propaganda but by the memory of smoke rising from Hawaii. America had been humiliated, but humiliation turned quickly to purpose. In the weeks that followed, Roosevelt's government launched an extraordinary campaign of mobilization. Aircraft carriers under construction were completed in record time. Shipyards in California and Virginia worked around the clock. Pilots trained day and night. The wounded fleet began to heal, its ships emerging from dry docks like resurrected giants. Still, victory felt far away. The Japanese advanced on every front: Burma, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. The Allies were losing everywhere. American headlines spoke not of triumph, but of survival. Yet beneath the despair, small embers of defiance began to glow. In April 1942, a plan took shape, one so daring it bordered on madness. 16 B-25 bombers, too large for carrier decks, would be modified to launch from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. Their mission, to bomb Tokyo itself. Led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, the raid was symbolic, a message carved into the sky. The damage to Japan would be minimal, but the psychological effect would be seismic. For the first time, Japanese civilians heard air raid sirens wailing over their own capital. For the first time, the empire that had conquered so much felt fear. The Doolittle Raiders launched on April 18, 1942. Many would never return. Some crash-landed in China, others were captured, executed, or saved by villagers who risked their lives to hide them. But their sacrifice echoed across the Pacific. America had struck back. The wound of Pearl Harbor had begun to bleed less with pain, and more with purpose. Roosevelt's announcement of the raid electrified the nation. The message was clear: the United States would not remain on its knees. Even in Japan, the impact was immense. The Imperial Navy's High Command, humiliated and alarmed, demanded to know how enemy aircraft had reached Tokyo. Admiral Yamamoto took it personally. The man who had planned Pearl Harbor saw the Doolittle raid as proof that his initial victory was incomplete. If Japan did not annihilate the remaining American carriers, those very ships would become the tools of Japan's destruction. In his headquarters aboard the Yamato, Yamamoto began planning the operation that would restore the empire's pride, a massive strike to lure and destroy the American fleet once and for all. His chosen battleground, Midway Atoll. But before Midway, there would come another test, the Battle of the Coral Sea. In May 1942, Japanese forces moved south toward Port Moresby, threatening Australia. Nimitz sent 2 carriers, Lexington and Yorktown, to intercept them. The result was the first naval battle in history fought entirely by aircraft. Neither fleet saw the other. Their planes met in the skies above the open ocean, trading blows through clouds and flame. Both sides suffered losses, but strategically, Coral Sea was a revelation. Japan's advance toward the south had been halted. For the first time in the war, the rising tide had stopped. Though Lexington was lost and Yorktown damaged, Nimitz recognized what few others did: Coral Sea had changed the rhythm of the war. "We can fight them," he said simply. "And we can win." In America, the news of Coral Sea reached a population hungry for hope. Pearl Harbor had been vengeance unreturned. Now, there was proof that vengeance could be earned, that courage and ingenuity could stand against empire. And so, as summer approached, two nations prepared for the next reckoning. In Tokyo, Yamamoto refined his plan to annihilate the remaining American carriers. In Hawaii, Nimitz placed his faith in intelligence, in courage, and in the spirit of a nation reborn. The echoes of Pearl Harbor still resounded, not as cries of defeat, but as a steady drumbeat of determination. What began as humiliation had transformed into a vow: the United States would rise. And soon, in the heart of the Pacific, it would strike back with all the fury that December morning had unleashed. The stage was set. The storm was gathering. And at a tiny ring of coral called Midway, history was waiting. On a quiet morning in the spring of 1942, as the Pacific still smoldered from the flames of Pearl Harbor, one man saw the path to ending the war in the East. The man was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a brilliant strategist and the architect of Japan's early victories. His eyes scanned the maps laid out before him, the intricate lines of red ink drawn across the vast expanse of the Pacific. There was one remaining obstacle between Japan and its imperial destiny: the United States Pacific Fleet. Yamamoto's plan was clear, ambitious, and built on a single belief: the Americans could still be broken. His greatest asset was their overconfidence. The attack on Pearl Harbor had shattered the U.S. fleet, but the Americans were not yet defeated. They were angry, and they would strike back. Yamamoto knew it. What the Americans lacked, however, was the will to confront the Japanese fleet on its terms. And Yamamoto intended to lure them into a final, decisive confrontation. To do that, he needed to create the illusion of a victory that would demand American retaliation. He needed to strike where the Americans were weakest and draw their carriers into a trap. The key to it all: Midway Atoll. Midway was an insignificant speck of land in the vast expanse of the Pacific. Barely 2.4 miles across, its strategic value was limited, at best. But Yamamoto had studied the Americans, and in their unmistakable thirst for revenge, he saw an opportunity. Midway's proximity to Hawaii, its value as a U.S. outpost, and its symbolic importance made it the perfect bait. Yamamoto understood that the U.S. Navy's only real hope of survival in the Pacific was to preserve its carriers. If he could lure them into a trap, his fleet would be able to strike them down before they even realized what had happened. The battle would be swift, decisive, and deadly. He had learned the Americans' habits well. Their intelligence had become formidable, but Yamamoto's spies had been able to deceive them by masking his true intentions. He had already thrown the bait with a campaign against the Aleutian Islands, designed to pull U.S. resources away from the main theater. But Yamamoto's real target lay deeper in the Pacific. To destroy Midway and lure the American fleet into the open, Yamamoto would need not only deception but precision. His grand design would require the coordination of multiple fleets converging from all directions. The Japanese High Command, eager for decisive victory, rallied behind Yamamoto's bold strategy. The plan was flawless, or so they thought. It would not only strike at the heart of America's Pacific power, but it would also break its spirit. By inflicting another catastrophic blow to the U.S. fleet, Japan could push its enemies into negotiations, forcing them to acknowledge Japan's ascendancy in the Pacific. The war would end on Japan's terms, before it could truly begin in earnest. The plan was complex. Yamamoto would assemble a fleet of 4 aircraft carriers, a collection of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, all tasked with converging upon the Midway atoll and crushing the American forces stationed there. He would execute a three-pronged attack. The main assault on Midway by air, with bombers and dive bombers designed to destroy the island's defenses and airstrips. A secondary diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands, drawing American forces away from the main target. A surprise attack on the U.S. carriers, lured into the trap once Yamamoto's forces had taken Midway. The idea was simple: the Japanese fleet would strike first, devastating the American carriers before they could retaliate. For Yamamoto, the success of this plan was not just a military victory, it was a strategic coup. In one swift stroke, he would prove to the world that Japan was an indomitable power, capable of crushing its enemies with the speed and precision of its military machine. It was a gamble, but it was one he was willing to take, for the stakes were nothing less than Japan's future as a dominant power in the Pacific. But the greatest flaw in Yamamoto's brilliance was not a flaw in tactics. It was a flaw in his understanding of his opponent. In his overconfidence, he underestimated the resilience and ingenuity of the United States. Yamamoto had assumed that the American Navy, wounded by Pearl Harbor, would take months to recover, allowing Japan time to solidify its gains in the Pacific. Yet the Americans were rebuilding, and they were not the naive, distracted force Yamamoto had hoped for. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, had a deep understanding of Japan's plans, thanks to the relentless work of U.S. codebreakers who had cracked the Japanese naval code. In the shadows, they had intercepted and decrypted crucial Japanese messages. Midway was no longer a secret attack, it was a message. The Americans knew it was coming. They knew when, where, and how Japan would strike. The question now was, could they turn Yamamoto's gamble into his downfall? Nimitz was not the type of man to take victory for granted. He understood the stakes. This was not just a battle for a small island, but a battle for the future of the Pacific. The lesson of Pearl Harbor still stung deeply within the American psyche, and he knew that if Midway were lost, it would be a blow that could not be recovered from. The Pacific Fleet had to be preserved, but it also had to strike back. Nimitz's decision was to meet Yamamoto head-on, drawing him into a trap of their own. The hunters had become the hunted. As the Japanese fleet set sail toward Midway, Yamamoto's confidence only grew. He believed the Americans were too weak to stop him. But behind the walls of Nimitz's command center, the planning began in earnest. There was no room for error. Everything, from aircraft, to timing, to intelligence, had to come together in one devastating strike. Meanwhile, the Japanese were unaware that their every move had been anticipated. Yamamoto's overconfidence, the belief that Midway was his for the taking, would soon meet with the cold reality of the Pacific's vastness. The same ocean he had used to advance with speed and efficiency would soon become his enemy. The tide, though still rising in Japan's favor, would soon begin to turn. In the days leading up to the attack, the sun set on Yamamoto's empire, casting long shadows across the Pacific. His gamble, though brilliantly executed in design, was beginning to show cracks. And as the Japanese fleet approached Midway, they would find themselves not in control of the situation, but trapped by their own ambition. The storm was gathering, but this time, the winds of fate would blow in a different direction. In the early days of 1942, before the aircraft engines roared, before the bombs fell on Midway, a quieter, more subtle battle raged in the shadows of military strategy, a battle fought not with fire and steel, but with intellect and patience. It was a battle of cryptography, where every letter decoded was a step closer to victory or defeat. The key to the coming confrontation lay not in the bombers or the fighters, but in the radio waves that hummed through the air. The Japanese had used a cipher so sophisticated that it was said to be unbreakable. Their JN-25 code, a complex system of symbols and substitutions, had confounded the best minds of the Allies. To break it meant gaining the ability to anticipate the enemy's every move, to read their plans before they were executed, a strategic advantage unlike any other. But for months, the task of breaking the code had eluded America's cryptanalysts. The U.S. Navy's Station HYPO, located in Hawaii, was at the heart of this struggle. Here, in a nondescript building far from the front lines, a small team of linguists and mathematicians worked day and night, sifting through intercepted Japanese messages. Among them was Commander Joseph Rockefort, an enigmatic figure with a reputation for brilliance and an unshakable belief in the value of intelligence. Rockefort had long understood the importance of cracking the Japanese code. But in the early months of the war, the progress was slow, until something shifted. Then, in early May 1942, Rockefort and his team uncovered a breakthrough that would change the course of the war. A radio message, intercepted by chance, contained an abbreviation, AF. The message was unclear, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a strategic target, something the Japanese were preparing to strike. But where? What was AF? Rockefort's intuition, honed by years of studying Japanese patterns and thought, told him it was Midway Atoll. But his colleagues in Washington, many of whom were still skeptical of the cryptanalysis efforts in Hawaii, rejected the idea outright. They believed that AF could be any number of things, a code for a position in the Aleutian Islands, or even a diversionary target. The men in Washington clung to the possibility that the message might be another part of Japan's broader strategy, but Rockefort's gut told him otherwise. Undeterred, Rockefort ordered a radio broadcast to be sent from Midway, pretending to be a routine transmission about water purification problems. The message was crafted to catch the Japanese interceptors by surprise. Within days, Rockefort intercepted a Japanese transmission that confirmed his suspicion. AF was indeed Midway. It was a stunning revelation, the first major victory in the intelligence war that would turn the tide of the Pacific. The Japanese, unaware that their most critical plans had been compromised, were preparing for an all-out assault on Midway. With this knowledge, Admiral Nimitz could prepare his forces to meet the attack head-on, tipping the balance before a single shot was fired. Yet despite this critical breakthrough, Washington still hesitated. Some of the top officers in the Pacific still believed the Midway theory was a gamble. The skepticism in the higher ranks of the military was palpable. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, was concerned about the risks of committing so many resources to what still seemed like an uncertain lead. But Nimitz, newly appointed to lead the U.S. Pacific Fleet, placed his trust in Rockefort's intelligence, and the decision was made: the fleet would sail toward Midway. At the time, it was a decision that many thought reckless. Nimitz had only one aircraft carrier available for the operation, Yorktown, and its deck was still undergoing repairs after the Battle of the Coral Sea. But Nimitz had confidence in the intelligence and Rockefort's analysis. If Midway was the Japanese target, it would be their most vulnerable moment, the moment they could be lured into a trap. The silent duel of information now took center stage. While Yamamoto's fleet moved toward Midway, the American forces readied themselves. On June 4, 1942, as the Japanese fleet steamed toward their intended target, the U.S. fleet, led by Admirals Nimitz, Fletcher, and Spruance, would be waiting, not as hunters, but as survivors who had learned from their defeat and prepared to deal the fatal blow. As the battle would soon show, intelligence would become the deciding weapon. In the quiet, secluded room of Station HYPO, the codebreakers had made their mark, and now it was time for the military to execute the ultimate plan. And yet, even with this remarkable advantage, there was no certainty. The Americans still had to fight. The Japanese fleet was immense, and their pilots were experienced, the best the world had ever seen. The American fleet, though equipped with the intelligence they needed, was still vastly outnumbered, Midway would not be won on paper, it would be won in the skies. Tone, tense intellect, victory born from thought, not fire. The quiet triumph of cryptography, the calm before the storm of battle. As the first rays of dawn broke over the Pacific, the stage was set, a quiet storm was gathering, and beneath the surface, the great clash of empires was about to unfold. For the United States, the Battle of Midway would be the culmination of months of preparation, intelligence, and resolve. For the Japanese, it would be the moment they believed would break the American will. But in the silent spaces before the conflict began, something far more crucial was at play, a game of deception, a battle of wits, and the trap within the trap. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz had studied the intelligence provided by Joseph Rockefeller and the cryptanalysts at Station HYPO with a calm but unwavering resolve. He knew that Midway was the target, and he also knew that if Japan's carriers were allowed to attack, it would be a disaster. Nimitz's strategy, daring in its simplicity, was to ambush the ambushers. He would draw the Japanese into a fight they didn't expect, luring them toward destruction. The key to this plan lay in a near-perfect application of misdirection and patience. Nimitz's fleet, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown, would take position northeast of Midway, far from the expected path of attack. The plan was clear: bait the Japanese carriers into a trap, where they would be attacked before they could escape or retaliate. But everything hinged on precision timing and perfect execution. Nimitz's fleet was vastly outnumbered, and this was a high-stakes gamble. To the men aboard the three carriers, there was no sense of immediate urgency. Days stretched on as they prepared their planes, organized their crews, and carried out drills. None of them knew how pivotal the next few days would be. They were unaware that their training would soon shift from routine to life and death. But beneath the outward calm, every sailor, every pilot, every officer was keenly aware of what was coming. The American carriers, powerful as they were outmatched by the size and strength of the Japanese fleet. The Enterprise, the oldest of the three American carriers, had already seen action in the Coral Sea. The Yorktown was fresh off repairs after surviving a brutal encounter just weeks before. The Hornet, newly commissioned, was about to see its first real test. Their planes, dauntless dive bombers, Wildcat fighters, and torpedo bombers, were ready, but the outcome of the battle would depend on their ability to strike first and strike fast. Meanwhile, Yamamoto's fleet, which had sailed to attack Midway, relied on an intelligence network that had become dangerously complacent. The Japanese had underestimated the American ability to respond. Yamamoto's reconnaissance flights showed no signs of the full strength of the American fleet. Their planes reported no substantial American presence near Midway. The Japanese had assumed the American carriers had not yet recovered from Pearl Harbor, and this assumption would prove fatal. The Japanese command believed that their superiority in numbers and air power would give them the decisive edge. But the true advantage lay in what the Japanese didn't know: the United States had cracked their codes, understood their strategy, and could predict their movements. The element of surprise was about to swing decisively in the Americans' favor. But even with the intelligence advantage, the United States would need more than just the right information. The real test would come in the skies, in the timing of the first strike, in the courage of the pilots, in the hands of those who would face the fury of the Japanese war machine. The Japanese mistakes began with their reconnaissance. Having already fallen prey to miscalculation, they failed to detect the presence of American submarines lurking in their path. The USS Nautilus, SS Tautog, and SS Tambor quietly shadowed the Japanese fleet, awaiting their moment to strike. The Japanese fleet had no idea they were being watched, their blind spots and weaknesses growing ever more apparent. The tone on the American side was one of controlled intensity. The men aboard the carriers knew that they had only one shot. There would be no second chance. the stakes could not have been higher. Midway was not just about holding a small island, it was about the survival of the Pacific Fleet, the protection of Hawaii, and the fight to break the Japanese momentum that had held the Pacific in a stranglehold for months. As the carriers positioned themselves and the planes were prepared for takeoff, the men looked to the skies, clouds gathering, winds rising, and the weight of their mission becoming ever clearer. The Japanese fleet was coming. But the Americans would strike first, and it would be in the first strike that the fate of the Pacific would be decided. The carriers rose and sailed westward, their mission set. They knew the Japanese were coming, but they didn't know how much they would be in for. What they did know was that they had one opportunity to break Japan's spirit, to turn the tide of the Pacific War, to redeem the horrors of Pearl Harbor, and to prove that America could fight not just with force, but with wisdom and courage. The trap was set. Midway was about to become the battlefield of a lifetime, a moment where the entire Pacific War would pivot, from defeat to victory. The Pacific sky, usually a vast expanse of tranquil blue, was suddenly a theater of chaos. On the morning of June 4, 1942, it ignited with the flames of war as the first wave of Japanese air attacks descended on Midway Atoll, signaling the beginning of a battle that would decide the fate of the Pacific. It began in a cloud of smoke and steel. Hundreds of Japanese bombers, dive bombers, and fighters appeared out of the rising sun, their engines roaring as they tore across the horizon. Below them, the men of Midway's defenses had been expecting the attack, but no one could have predicted the scale of the assault. At Midway, the early hours of the morning were quiet. On the island, Marine pilots and ground crew scrambled into their aircraft, readying for an attack they knew would come, but not when, or with what force. The island's radar had spotted the incoming planes, but the information was vague. The fog of war had already begun to descend. The Japanese had the advantage of surprise and the power of numbers. They knew exactly where the U.S. forces were, but the Americans were still piecing together their position, unsure of the full scale of the attack. In the distance, the Japanese bombers had been launched from the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, their mission clear: annihilate Midway's air defenses, cripple its runways, and pave the way for the eventual invasion of the island. Midway's airfield was the primary target, as it stood between Japan and a successful occupation of the Pacific. As the Japanese bombers made their approach, the Marine Corps pilots were already in the air. They had been flying outdated F-4F Wildcat fighters, far less agile and armed than their Japanese counterparts. The Wildcats, though sturdy, were no match for the Zeros, the famed Japanese fighters that swooped in for the kill with precision and speed. Captain Richard Fleming, one of the Marine pilots, climbed into his Wildcat with a sense of urgency. His squadron was small, but the pressure was immense. As he started his engines, his mind was focused. They had to buy time. They couldn't win in the sky, but they could disrupt, confuse, delay. His orders were simple: keep the Japanese busy long enough for reinforcements to arrive. As the Japanese bombers approached, the first wave of U.S. Marine fighters surged into the sky, defying the overwhelming odds. A dogfight erupted immediately. The skies above Midway became a maelstrom of bullets, planes, and fire. The Japanese Zeros dove down with deadly accuracy, and Marine pilots found themselves in a desperate struggle to keep the airspace clear long enough for their comrades to scramble into position. But it wasn't enough. The Japanese dive bombers, precise and terrifying, swooped in from above, releasing their bombs just as the Marine Wildcats fell behind, outmaneuvered and overpowered. The explosions rang out across Midway, sending shockwaves through the island, and tearing apart the fragile defenses. The airstrips were hit, making it harder for the American planes to take off and engage in the fight. In the midst of the chaos, U.S. torpedo squadrons made their move. Squadron VT-8, a group of TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, flown by men who knew their chances were slim. Armed with only their torpedoes, they dove directly into the fray, facing a sea of Japanese fighters and bombers. The pilots knew they were walking into a slaughter. The odds of survival were slim, but they had no choice. This was the moment to act. As the torpedo bombers dived into the attack, Japanese fighters raked them with gunfire, sending planes spiraling into the ocean. Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, the leader of VT-8, knew this might be his final mission. His squadron was outnumbered and outgunned, but he held his formation together, pressing forward with relentless courage. In those final moments, the men of VT-8 pushed their planes past the edge of safety, knowing they were sacrificing their lives to create an opening for others. The first attack waves of the Japanese were overwhelming. The air over Midway turned into a frenzy of gunfire and explosions, each second a clash of lives and fates. But the Americans refused to buckle. Even as their planes were shot down, as their airstrips burned, they held fast. Amidst the fire, there was one truth they had learned from the mistakes of Pearl Harbor. They would not surrender. Not here. Not now. But in the confusion, the fog of war thickened. Both sides had a rough idea of where the enemy was, but neither could clearly understand the full picture. Midway's defenses were burning, and the Japanese had no idea that the American carriers were already closing in. Yamamoto's fleet, confident in their superiority, thought they had the Americans boxed in. But the tide was turning, and they couldn't see it yet. The battle at Midway would be defined by courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The torpedo squadrons, despite their high losses, had done their job. They had forced the Japanese fleet to split and focus on the incoming American forces. They had bought time for what was about to happen. But the cost was devastating. Only a few of the torpedo bombers managed to reach their target, and even fewer survived the encounter. The Wildcats that had engaged in the dogfight were now flying with little to no fuel, having barely held the skies long enough to make a difference. And still, the Americans waited. They had given their all, now it was time for the next phase of the plan to unfold. The storm had gathered, but the true fury would come from the American dive bombers. The skies above Midway were still thick with smoke, still full of the shattered remnants of battle. Both sides were battered, confused, but in that confusion, the American aircraft carriers moved into position. Midway, the small outpost of sand and coral, was the trap, and now, the trap would snap shut. The sky over the Pacific, a pale blue expanse of nothingness just moments ago, was now alive with a roar. The pulse of battle, quickening with every passing second, became a deafening crescendo as the American dive bombers began their approach. It was June 4, 1942, the moment that would decide the fate of the Pacific War, the day that would change everything. In the sky above Midway Atoll, squadrons from the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown had finally found what they were looking for, the Japanese carriers that had, for weeks, been presumed to be miles beyond American reach. The tide of battle had shifted. The Japanese had not expected this, had not anticipated the power of intelligence and timing working so perfectly against them. Admiral Yamamoto's plan had been built on certainty, that he would destroy Midway and, with it, the remnants of the American fleet. He had anticipated that his forces would outlast any potential American resistance. Yet in the span of mere minutes, everything would change. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, floated majestically above the sea, unaware of the catastrophe unfolding. Their decks were bustling with activity, planes refueling, bombs being prepared, air crews working in perfect harmony. They thought they had all the time in the world. But that was before the storm arrived. The American SBD Dauntless dive bombers, flying at low altitude to avoid enemy radar, had found their mark. As the Japanese carriers loomed large in their crosshairs, the bombers released their payloads in near-perfect synchronization. For the men and the bombers, the next moments were a blur of determination, their bombs falling straight and true, aimed directly at the heart of Japan's fleet. The first explosion tore into Akagi, and the world seemed to slow to a single, eternal heartbeat. Fire erupted in an instant, a towering column of smoke and flame ripping through the carrier's flight deck. There was no time to react. The bomb had ignited a magazine, and the ship's fate was sealed in an instant. The mighty Akagi, the flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy, would burn in a matter of minutes. The fire spread like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. Men on deck were flung into the air, their bodies torn apart in the heat and the blast. In an almost choreographed sequence, the same fate befell the Kaga and Soryu. The American dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey from the Enterprise, were on target and on time, their bombs falling with ruthless precision. The Kaga was the next to explode, a tremendous blast that ripped through its hull, sending it to the ocean floor. Soryu, trying to maneuver desperately to fight back, was also struck, its fuel stores detonating in a fiery embrace. On the Japanese carriers, chaos erupted. The fire spread like a living thing, consuming men and machines alike. Planes that had been lined up on the decks exploded, their fuel igniting and sending fireballs into the sky. The Japanese air crews, already in position for their attack on Midway, could only watch as their ships were consumed by fire and smoke. Some jumped into the flames rather than face capture, others ran, desperate for any kind of escape, knowing the sea was their only option. The Japanese command was paralyzed by confusion and horror. No one could understand how the Americans had managed to strike so decisively, how their attack had been so fast, so devastating. They had failed to anticipate that the Americans, who had once been caught by surprise, would now strike first, faster, and with such deadly precision. In the space of just minutes, the balance of the Pacific War shifted forever. What had been a confident Japanese offensive now lay in ruin. Their 4 fleet carriers, once the keystone of their dominance, were now burning, sinking, and with them, the heart of the Imperial Navy. The aircraft that had once dominated the skies were gone, reduced to twisted wreckage on the ocean floor. Yamamoto's gamble had failed. The plan that had seemed so certain, so meticulously calculated, had turned into a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The American fleet had not been broken, it had struck back, and the strike was so decisive that the Japanese found themselves unable to recover. On the American side, the excitement was tempered by the realization that the battle was far from won. The Yorktown had been severely damaged by a Japanese counterattack, and despite the joy of their success, the Americans knew that the battle was still ongoing. The Japanese Hiryu, though badly damaged, was still in play. They would need to stay vigilant, the Japanese might be down, but they were far from out. Yet the sheer explosive revelation of what had just transpired was undeniable. In a matter of moments, the fate of the Pacific Fleet had been decided. The tide had turned. What had begun as a gamble for the Japanese had become a cataclysmic loss. The Japanese carriers were gone, and with them, the aura of invincibility that had defined their empire. On the American side, the pilots, their mission complete, began their descent back toward the carriers. Their nerves were frayed, their bodies exhausted, but their hearts were filled with a surge of pride and disbelief. They had done the impossible. In the face of overwhelming odds, they had struck first and struck hard. As the planes touched down on their respective carriers, the sky above Midway seemed to clear for the first time in days. The smoke from the burning carriers still hung in the air, but the victory was complete. The balance of the Pacific War had shifted. The Americans had struck first, and in doing so, had irrevocably changed the course of history. The American victory at Midway was not a simple triumph. For every moment of celebration, there was an awareness of the fragility of their success. The sun had barely set on the smoke and fire that had consumed the Japanese carriers when the remnants of the Imperial Navy began to retaliate. The battle was far from over. In the aftermath of the devastation caused by the American dive bombers, the Japanese carrier Hiryu, though crippled, remained operational. Unlike its sister ships, which had been engulfed in flames and reduced to wreckage, the Hiryu still possessed its fighting spirit and its aircraft. It was a dying beast, but it still had claws. As the Yorktown limped back toward the safety of the fleet, its flight deck scarred from the earlier attacks, the Hiryu struck, the last desperate act of a navy already on the brink of collapse. The remaining Japanese bombers launched from Hiryu's decks, their engines roaring across the sky, determined to turn the tide of battle. The U.S. fleet, still reveling in the wreckage of the Japanese carriers, was blindsided by the attack. The bombers targeted the Yorktown, the very ship that had been instrumental in the victory. The Hiryu's bombers found their mark. The Yorktown, its deck already damaged and crew exhausted, took several direct hits. Flames erupted from its hull as fuel and bombs ignited. The moment the bomb struck, it was as though time stopped. A silent, sickening realization swept over the American crew. They had lost one of their carriers, the same ship that had been a linchpin in the battle's early success. It was a bitter blow, a reminder that no victory in war is without cost. Below deck, the crew scrambled to fight fires and contain the damage. But there was little they could do. The Yorktown had suffered too much. Fires raged uncontrollably, and the ship was quickly sinking. The once proud symbol of American naval might was now helpless in the waters of the Pacific. The damage to Yorktown would later lead to its eventual sinking, an agonizing conclusion for a ship that had only days earlier been a vital force in the victory over the Japanese. Despite the pain of loss, the U.S. forces pressed forward. The American pilots, weary from their earlier attacks and the constant toll of the battle, regrouped. With the smoke of burning Japanese carriers still hanging in the air, they set their sights on the Hiryu. The resolve of the American forces remained unbroken. The loss of the Yorktown only solidified their determination to end the battle decisively. In a late-day attack, American dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Wade McCluskey from the Enterprise, took to the skies once more. Through clouds and smoke, they hunted down the last remaining Japanese carrier. As they closed in on the Hiryu, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the Pacific. But this was not the peaceful calm of a sunset. It was the last, violent gasp of an empire in collapse. The Hiryu, once proud and brimming with confidence, now found itself outmatched and vulnerable. American pilots struck with precision. A devastating series of bombs rained down on the Japanese carrier's deck. Within minutes, the Hiryu was engulfed in flames. A moment later, a massive explosion tore through its hull, sending the ship to the bottom of the Pacific. The battle had turned in an instant. Where once the Japanese fleet had dominated, now there was only devastation. The Hiryu's death marked the end of the Japanese carrier's strength, and with it, the final hope for Japan's naval supremacy in the Pacific. As the sun finally set over the Pacific, night fell over burning seas. The black smoke of the Japanese carriers mingled with the red and orange glow of their final flames. The Pacific, for the first time since the war had begun, seemed still, as if even the ocean itself had paused to witness the scale of the carnage. On both sides, the toll was immense. The Japanese had lost 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, and with them, nearly their entire carrier air fleet. The Imperial Navy was left shattered, its pride and strength destroyed in a matter of hours. On the American side, the loss of Yorktown was devastating, but it could be replaced. The Japanese, however, had no such luxury. For the Americans, the victory at Midway was a turning point. They had lost a carrier, but they had won the war at sea. Japan's expansion was halted, and the U.S. Navy was no longer on the defensive. The battle had been hard fought, and both sides bled for every inch. But in the end, the Americans had struck first, struck hard, and struck decisively. Yet the cost of this victory was already clear. The Pacific War would continue for years to come. Midway had not ended the conflict, it had only marked the beginning of the long road toward Japan's eventual defeat. The sun set on June 4, 1942, and with it, the carnage that had consumed the morning's battle began to settle into an eerie stillness. The Pacific, once a vast and seemingly endless expanse of water, had become a floating graveyard, a place where the dead and the living moved in quiet procession, carried by the tides. In the aftermath of the battle, the ocean bore the scars of the conflict. Oil slicks stained the water black, the remnants of the destroyed Japanese carriers and the crippled USS Yorktown mixing with the salt water. The fires from the wrecked ships continued to burn, their smoke rising like specters into the twilight sky, blotting out the stars. There was no joy in the victory, only the sorrow of a battle fought to its brutal end, leaving nothing but a sea filled with wreckage and loss. As the Japanese survivors floated in the water, some still clinging to pieces of debris, American destroyers moved slowly through the oil-streaked sea, their lights dimmed, their engines rumbling softly. They were not triumphant, they were rescuers, collecting the broken fragments of the enemy's pride. Sailors, some barely conscious, others screaming from wounds, were hauled aboard, their faces masks of exhaustion and despair. There was no cheering, no sense of conquest. Only the grim silence of those who had witnessed too much death, too much ruin. The rescuers offered no words of comfort. Some men, weary beyond belief, had lost themselves in the depths of the ocean, swallowed by the very sea they had once sailed to dominate. As the rescue crews worked, they pulled the dead and the living alike from the oily water, and the night air was thick with the smell of death. The ships that had survived the battle were battered, their decks marked by fire and blood. The Japanese survivors, some of them still in shock, had little to say. Some stared blankly at the American ships, understanding that they had lost everything, not just the battle, but their empire, their sailors, their hope. The silence was broken only by the occasional cry for help or the sound of footsteps as men moved across the decks. The ocean was vast, and yet it had become so small, so intimate, with the remnants of battle swirling in its waters. The survivors, American and Japanese alike, were now nothing more than ghosts, drifting on a sea that seemed to hold them in suspension, waiting for something to happen. But nothing would happen now. The war was not over, but the fate of the fleets had already been sealed. Meanwhile, the submarines that had waited silently during the battle emerged from the depths like predators hunting their wounded prey. American subs, aware of the Japanese retreat, lurked beneath the waves, their periscopes skimming the surface, watching for any sign of a Japanese vessel that might still be afloat. Torpedoes were ready, though the battles of Midway had already been fought above them. The submarines knew their part in the war was far from over. But for now, they remained in the shadows, watching, waiting, and listening to the eerie quiet of a battlefield after the violence had ceased. For the men aboard the ships, both American and Japanese, there was no clarity about who had won and who had lost. To the American sailors, victory had come at a terrible cost. The Yorktown, their triumph, was now sinking beneath the waves, and with it, the lives of the brave men who had made their last stand. The loss of the Yorktown was a bitter reminder that war could never be clean, never be without sacrifice. The victory at Midway had cost them dearly, and the price of war could not be counted by the number of ships sunk or the victories won in battle. As the ships drifted through the oil-slicked waters, the crews whispered their prayers into the night. Some whispered them for the men they had lost, others for the men they had killed. And others, caught between the two, whispered them simply because there was nothing else left to say. The Pacific, the same vast ocean that had been the theater for so much ambition, so much bloodshed, now felt like a tomb, a graveyard for the ambitions of both empires. The night descended without fanfare, the moon hanging in the sky like a distant witness. There was no celebratory music from the radios, no cheering, no victory. The sea, a silent observer, held both the living and the dead in its embrace. The wreckage of the carriers, the planes, and the bodies were carried on its tides, as though the ocean itself was trying to swallow the past. The waves lapped softly against the hulls of the ships, carrying with them the sounds of battle now silenced by the night. In the distance, faint plumes of smoke still rose from the horizon where the Japanese carriers had been struck. The Japanese fleet was shattered, its pride broken, its future uncertain. The American fleet, while victorious, was also wounded. Their triumph was not without loss. The battle was over, but the war raged on, and the sea, ever present, became a graveyard, a living, breathing witness to the madness of war. Each wave, each shift of water carried the story of the men who had fought, the lives lost, and the empires brought to their knees. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the Pacific on June 5, 1942, the world had already changed. The deafening roar of battle had faded into an uneasy silence, leaving behind the remnants of two fleets, one shattered, the other bruised but victorious. The American victory at Midway was not the loud, exuberant triumph of Hollywood war films. There were no parades, no raucous celebrations. The soldiers aboard the victorious ships had no time for rejoicing. Instead, they were left to reckon with the true weight of what had just transpired. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were gone. Destroyed in a series of devastating American dive bomber strikes, they now lay at the bottom of the Pacific, their proud flags and skilled air crews lost forever. It was an unprecedented blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy, one they would never recover from. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted in a matter of hours, and with it, the course of the war. The reports came in over the radio, delivered with the clinical precision of military men who had long since learned to detach themselves from the emotional weight of battle. The words were simple, but their impact was monumental. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed. America's first great triumph of the Pacific War. The men aboard Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet read the message in disbelief. They knew what had been achieved, but the reality of it hadn't yet fully sunk in. For carriers, the pride of Japan's naval fleet, sunk in a single day. The same carriers that had ravaged the American fleet at Pearl Harbor just months earlier were now gone. Their destruction had been swift, almost too quick to believe. The Soviet Union sent a quiet message of congratulations. Britain offered formal recognition. But there was no jubilant cheering, no victory bells ringing from Washington. There was only the grief of war, a quiet acknowledgement that victory, no matter how hard won, came at a price. On the Japanese side, the reaction was not much different. In the stillness of Tokyo, the news of Midway's defeat reached the Imperial Palace and Yamamoto's quarters with a shocking quietness. The immediate reaction from the Japanese military was confusion. No one could comprehend how such a disaster had unfolded. The fleet that had been the cornerstone of Japan's Pacific ambitions had been wiped out in an afternoon. Admiral Yamamoto, the man who had orchestrated the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and led Japan to the edge of empire, retreated into a silence so profound it seemed to swallow him whole. His trusted subordinates had told him that Midway was an easy victory, that American forces were still in disarray from the Pearl Harbor attack, and that the United States was too fractured to respond with strength. Yamamoto had believed this. The Japanese Navy was the most powerful force in the Pacific. Yet now, in the wake of the disaster, he knew the truth: the Empire of Japan was no longer invincible. Yamamoto's private contemplation was one of crushing weight, the enormity of the failure, the loss of so many ships and men, and the realization that his vision of a quick, decisive war was over. His retreat was not just from the battlefield, it was from the future he had built in his mind, one in which Japan was the undisputed ruler of the Pacific. As he paced the halls of his headquarters, Yamamoto's thoughts turned inward. He was a man of honor and had believed in his cause, but now he faced the truth: the war was no longer winnable on his terms. Back in Washington, Admiral Nimitz received the news of Midway's success with the calm efficiency that had come to define his leadership. He was not elated, nor did he allow himself the luxury of a full smile. Instead, he turned to those around him and offered only a single statement. This is the turning point. In that moment, Nimitz did not see Midway as the end of a conflict. He saw it as the beginning of a new phase, a phase in which the United States would no longer retreat. The battle had been a victory, yes, but the war was far from over. The Japanese had suffered a catastrophic blow, but their will to fight remained. There would be no immediate surrender. The next battles would be even more brutal, more determined. For the American public, Midway was a much-needed beacon of hope. Newsreels and newspapers would carry the story of the great victory across the country. It was a symbol of the resilience of a nation that had been knocked to its knees and had risen again. The story of Midway would become an emblem of American ingenuity, of strength born from humiliation, and of the ability to turn the tide of a seemingly unstoppable war. But for the men aboard the carriers, there was no real celebration. They knew that the loss of 4 carriers was devastating for Japan, but it would not end the war. The next phase would be harder, the stakes higher. And so, the men who had struck down the heart of the Japanese fleet began to prepare for what was to come: the next island, the next fight, the next battle. There would be no rest for them. The Pacific War had not ended with Midway. It had merely entered its next phase, and now, the United States would push forward, ever onward, into the heart of the enemy's empire. The sky over Midway was now clear, its calm waters reflecting a peace that felt unnatural after the chaos of the past 2 days. But beneath the tranquil surface, the ocean was still alive with the echoes of battle. The sounds of the dying, the sinking ships, and the failing engines now faded into the quiet of the Pacific, but they left a lingering weight that no amount of victory could remove. The price of valor had been paid in full, and the cost was steep. On the horizon, the ships of both sides began to move slowly through the waters. American destroyers skimmed the waves, moving with the same urgency as they had before the battle, but this time, their mission was not to attack, it was to rescue. Survivors from both sides were pulled from the burning seas, their faces etched with the same fatigue and despair that had consumed them in the final moments of battle. As they were hauled aboard, many of the Japanese sailors remained silent, their eyes vacant from the shock of their loss. The wreckage of their fleet was visible from the American ships, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, now charred and sinking into the sea, their once proud flight decks littered with the twisted remains of their aircraft. But amid the despair, some of the Japanese survivors began to sing hymns, their voices rising from the depths of the Pacific like ghosts, a final act of defiance before the waters swallowed them whole. It was a haunting moment, the men who had once stormed the Pacific with confidence now singing their last prayers to a sky that had grown silent. But for the American sailors who witnessed this, the song was not one of triumph. The victory at Midway had been won with a sacrifice that could not be measured in terms of ships or pilots or strategy. It had been won with the blood of men. As the survivors were pulled aboard, many looked away, their eyes filled with sorrow for what had been lost on both sides. They had fought and killed for an ideal, for a cause, for a nation, but in the end, the men they had fought against had been no different. They, too, were sons, fathers, brothers. They, too, had bled, suffered, and died. the personal weight of history's turning tide was not born on the battlefield alone. It was born in the hearts of those who had lived to see the aftermath. The airmen and torpedo pilots of Midway had given everything. They were the ones who had flown into the jaws of hell, their planes low on fuel, their targets constantly shifting in the chaos of battle. Many of them would never return to see their families again. The American pilots who had dove from their carriers had been met with the unrelenting fire of Japanese fighters, and those who survived the first wave only to engage in suicidal torpedo runs against the heavily armed Japanese carriers had little chance of survival. The Japanese fighters picked them off one by one, leaving behind burning wrecks on the ocean's surface. Among the fallen were Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, who had led his squadron to success after a perilous search for the Japanese fleet, and Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of the devastating torpedo strike. The men who had flown into the inferno of battle were now part of the history of Midway, their courage, their sacrifice, forever engraved in the narrative of America's first great victory in the Pacific. Their sacrifice was honored posthumously, as awards were issued to the surviving crew members and the families of the lost pilots. But even as the official recognition came, the grief of those who remained behind seemed more profound than any medal could convey. To the sailors and airmen who had lived, valor was no longer something celebrated in speeches. It was something that could only be felt in the quiet sorrow of surviving, in the weight of the lost comrades who could not be forgotten. On the decks of the American carriers, men stood in silence as the wreckage of Midway's battle was cleared away. The joy of victory was muted by the empty spaces where their comrades had once stood. Some had come to Midway to avenge Pearl Harbor, others to serve a cause they believed was greater than any individual life. But now, all were faced with the same undeniable truth: the cost of war, the price of honor and duty, was far more than they had ever anticipated. The sea, which had witnessed the ferocity of the battle, now became a silent memorial to the dead. For the men of Midway, it was the final resting place of those who had fought and sacrificed, fighters of both nations who would never see their homelands again. In the quiet aftermath, the lessons of the battle were clear: war was not just a fight of tactics and strategies, it was a sacrifice of humanity. Victory had been won, but it had come at the price of lives, not just of soldiers, but of ideals, families, and the fragile nature of life itself. The battle had ended, but the echoes of its violence still rang in the minds of those who had fought. The sea, once a vast, peaceful expanse, had become a graveyard of fire and foam, a place where the dead and the living now floated side by side. In the aftermath of the Battle of Midway, amidst the wreckage of the sinking Japanese carriers and the charred remnants of the USS Yorktown, there was silence, but only for a moment. Slowly, the voices of those who had survived began to rise from the depths, carried not by the winds or the waves, but by the fragile remnants of letters and diaries that had been written in the heat of battle. These were the real testimonies, not the reports filed by commanders or the accounts written for history books, but the words of men who had lived it, words captured in the fleeting moments before death had taken them. On the decks of the American carriers, there was a quiet understanding among the survivors. They knew that they had witnessed something extraordinary, but they also knew that they had paid a high price for it. Sailors, who had fought side by side, now looked to each other with the silent acknowledgement that their bond had been forged in the crucible of war. They had been the lucky ones, the ones who had made it out of the fire. But for every man they had saved, there were others who had not returned. Pilot reports and survivor accounts began to trickle back to the mainland, offering a glimpse into the reality of Midway. The bravery was unmistakable, but so too was the trauma. Lieutenant John Jack Baker, a pilot who had flown from the Enterprise, would later describe the final moments of the attack on the Japanese carriers. The sky was a mix of smoke and fire. We dove, we fired, and then we pulled up, all of us, knowing that we were outnumbered, knowing that we were barely going to make it. Some didn't. Some never came back. I remember the faces, and I remember the feeling of that moment. It wasn't fear, but something deeper, something like a strange peace. Like I'd been here before. I knew what had to happen. And when I pulled out of that dive, all I could think of was the others who weren't coming home. For those men, victory was a shared experience, not of triumph, but of survival. And it was a survival defined by sacrifice, by knowing that their own survival meant the loss of so many others. The Japanese sailors, though on the opposing side, were not forgotten. The battle had left its mark on them as well. After the sinking of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the survivors of these ships floated in the same ocean that had swallowed their comrades. In the darkness of the Pacific night, Japanese sailors, like their American counterparts, faced the same fate, alone in the vastness of the sea. The horror of battle had not been confined to one side. Hiroshi Takahashi, a Japanese pilot, would later recall. We thought we had destroyed them. We thought we were invincible. But as I stood on the deck of my ship, waiting for orders, watching the flames rise around me, I realized we were wrong. I could hear the American planes above us, and then, it was over. There was no escape. Just fire and smoke and the feeling of falling into the sea. The sea was the great equalizer. It made no distinction between friend and foe, between those who fought for empire and those who fought for survival. The ocean held them all, the dead and the living, with its eternal embrace. Among the wreckage, letters were found, drifting on the waves like the remnants of lives and hopes left behind. One such letter, written by a young Japanese sailor to his wife just before he set sail for Midway, was recovered by a U.S. Navy diver months later. My dearest, I don't know what will happen in this battle. But I want you to know that I love you more than life itself. If I do not return, do not weep for me. Remember only the love we shared. My only wish is that you find peace and happiness. The diver, who had later read the letter, placed it carefully into a small envelope and added it to a stack of other personal letters from both sides, lost in the chaos of war. The stories of these men, written with trembling hands in the moments before their lives were extinguished, became the truest accounts of the battle. They were not written in the language of strategy or politics but in the language of humanity, simple words, simple love, simple sorrow. Back on the American carriers, crews gathered in small groups, on the decks, in mess halls, or even in the quiet corners of the ship. They exchanged stories of the battle, of the faces they had seen, the men they had lost. Some shared laughs in an attempt to lighten the mood, but there was little joy left. Victory had come at a terrible cost. They all knew it. The war was not over, and the Pacific was still full of enemies. But for a brief moment, in the stillness of the aftermath, these men shared the knowledge of what it meant to survive. The Japanese survivors who would return home, many of them prisoners, would do the same, honoring their comrades, holding the memories of Midway deep within their hearts. Even as the Japanese Empire continued its desperate push across the Pacific, the shadow of Midway would forever haunt them. The news reached Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto slowly, as if the very air held its breath, unwilling to carry the crushing weight of the message. The man who had orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had led Japan's navy to early dominance in the Pacific, now stood at the edge of an abyss. The victory at Midway, the one that had seemed inevitable, had slipped from his grasp, and the pieces of his empire were starting to fall apart. Yamamoto's gambit had been bold, a brilliant stroke of strategy meant to crush America's resolve, to destroy its ability to fight back. He had carefully planned the attack, moving his fleet toward Midway with the expectation that, like so many times before, Japan's superiority in numbers and skill would overwhelm the enemy. It had been a calculated risk, one Yamamoto believed would end the war on Japan's terms, forcing America into negotiations before it could recover. But the tide of war, like the vast ocean Yamamoto had sailed for most of his life, could not be controlled. In the span of a few hours, Midway had become Japan's graveyard, its 4 carriers destroyed, its air fleet obliterated, and with it, the heart of Japan's naval power. Yamamoto's masterpiece had unraveled before his eyes, and the battle he had thought would seal victory had instead delivered the first mortal wound to the Imperial Navy. The admiral stood alone in his command room, the heavy silence pressing in around him. He had been a man of great ambition, a genius whose strategies had led Japan to conquer vast swaths of the Pacific. His was the mind that had conceived of Pearl Harbor, the attack that had crippled America's fleet, the strike that had marked the beginning of Japan's empire. Now, he felt the weight of his own actions, the burden of having gambled everything on a single stroke, only to see it fail in the most decisive of ways. In those moments, Yamamoto felt a deep, quiet despair. His confidence had been his greatest strength, but it was also the source of his downfall. His belief in Japan's invincibility had blinded him to the reality that even the most brilliant of plans can be undone by the fog of war. Codebreakers, whose work Yamamoto had never fully appreciated, had outmaneuvered him. The American cryptographers at Station HYPO had deciphered the Japanese naval codes, and Yamamoto's plans had been laid bare to the very enemy he had sought to deceive. The Americans knew his intentions before he had even set sail. It was not luck, but intelligence that had sealed Japan's fate. The loss of Midway was not just a military setback. It was the collapse of a vision that had extended from the Pacific Islands to the cities of America's west coast. Yamamoto had believed Japan could dominate the Pacific, that it could carve out a new order, an empire to rival the great powers of Europe. Now, with 4 of his best carriers at the bottom of the sea and no immediate means of replenishing their loss, that vision seemed fantastical, even absurd. He sat at his desk in the dimly lit cabin of his flagship, Yamato, and stared out over the ocean. The sea, once the symbol of Japan's strength, now felt like a cold, indifferent expanse. The very thing that had once carried him forward now seemed to mock him. With a heavy sigh, Yamamoto muttered to no one, "The war has turned." He had spoken the words quietly, as though acknowledging a truth he could no longer deny. The war, once Japan's to win, now seemed America's to lose. The great strategy that had placed Japan at the pinnacle of its power had now been undone in a single battle. There was no coming back from Midway. Yamamoto knew it. And yet, he could not bring himself to admit defeat aloud. The burden of responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders. As the architect of Japan's imperial ambitions, the failure of Midway was his failure. He had placed everything on a single, decisive attack, and the gamble had shattered his vision. The faces of the men he had led, the thousands of sailors and airmen who had died in the flames of Midway, haunted him. He had promised them glory, victory, and a new order. What would they think of him now? Yamamoto's sense of duty, his loyalty to the emperor, could not allow him to entertain thoughts of resignation or retreat. He was a soldier, and soldiers do not give up in the face of failure. But deep inside, he understood that the turning point had come. The loss at Midway would echo throughout Japan's military strategy, and the inevitable American counteroffensive had begun. His mind wandered back to the days before the attack, when the world had seemed within Japan's grasp. He had believed that the United States would falter, that the loss of its fleet would force America to the negotiating table. But now, as the American carriers continued to sail across the Pacific, unbowed, Yamamoto saw the true scale of the mistake. Japan's war machine, once unstoppable, had been broken at Midway, and no amount of military might would restore its momentum. Yamamoto's retreat into silence was not just a retreat from battle, it was a retreat into the knowledge that his legacy, once so full of promise, would now be defined by defeat. He would remain at the helm of the Imperial Navy, yes, but his authority had already begun to wane. The Japanese High Command, which had once trusted him unquestioningly, now saw him as the man who had lost them the war. The shame of Midway would never leave Yamamoto. It would follow him into his next battles, his next orders. It would linger like a shadow, waiting for the final moment when he would have to face the consequences of his belief, and the heavy price that had come with it. While the roar of battle echoed across the Pacific and the men aboard the aircraft carriers fought desperately to turn the tide, the true turning point at Midway was unfolding far away in a dimly lit, unassuming room on Oahu, Hawaii. At Station HYPO, a team of cryptanalysts sat hunched over their desks, deciphering intercepted Japanese messages. Among them, Commander Joseph Rockefort, the quiet and determined leader of the operation, listened with a mix of intensity and relief as the battle reports began to trickle in. For months, Rockefort and his team had worked tirelessly, deciphering the complex Japanese JN-25 cipher, cracking the code that had once been deemed unbreakable. The team's work had not been glamorous. There were no medals, no public recognition, no cheering crowds. Theirs was a victory built on patience, persistence, and most importantly, the quiet brilliance of intelligence. But now, as reports came in confirming the success of the American dive bombers' strikes on the Japanese carriers, Rockefort knew that his team's long hours, the hours spent hunched over machines, poring over endless streams of intercepted signals, solving one puzzle after another, had paid off. Their work had changed the course of the war. At that moment, as the confirmation arrived that Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were gone, Rockefort allowed himself a brief, almost imperceptible sigh. The victory, though glorious for the U.S. Navy, was not his to celebrate in the traditional sense. There would be no grand ceremonies, no speeches in his honor. It was simply another job well done. The enemy had been defeated, and the United States had been handed the chance to fight another day. For Rockefort, there was relief in knowing that the intelligence war had been won. The success at Midway had been built not on guns or bombs, but on information, on intellect. The American fleet's location, the timing of the Japanese strike, the vulnerability of their carriers, these were the pieces of the puzzle Rockefort and his team had patiently put together over the weeks leading up to the battle. The room in Station HYPO was filled with quiet murmurs as the news spread through the ranks. No one shouted or jumped in celebration. The team had worked in relative obscurity, away from the limelight, but they understood the magnitude of their contribution. Victory through intellect was not something that could be measured in medals or victory parades. It was a victory that would unfold in the history books, not in the press releases of war reporters. Rockefort turned to his team. They shared a moment of quiet acknowledgement, a subdued triumph in the shadows of the war. It was not glory they sought, but the simple satisfaction of having contributed to something far greater than themselves. They had given their nation a fighting chance, and in doing so, had changed the trajectory of the Pacific War. The Japanese fleet, once thought to be unstoppable, was now in disarray. The U.S. had struck the first blow, and it was intelligence, not sheer military power, that had made the difference. Yet even as they allowed themselves a moment of quiet pride, Rockefort understood the weight of their work. The victory at Midway was just the beginning. The war was far from over. The Japanese, though dealt a heavy blow, were not finished. Their resolve was unwavering, and their resources still vast. But for the first time in the war, America had a foothold, a step toward pushing back the tide of Japanese expansion. In the weeks that followed, Station HYPO continued its work, intercepting more Japanese communications and feeding critical information back to Nimitz and his fleet. But it was clear, the tide had turned. Midway had been a decisive victory, and without the work of Rockefort and his cryptanalysts, it may never have been possible. Commander Rockefeller's victory was not of the heroic, action-packed variety. There were no battles to fight, no planes to fly. Instead, there were long nights spent in a quiet, dimly lit room, surrounded by papers and machines, analyzing data that might seem meaningless to anyone outside their small circle. But in that room, Rockefeller knew something the world did not. He had struck a blow as decisive as any bomb. In the midst of a war that threatened to engulf the world, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz stood as the calm at the center of the storm. The aftermath of the Battle of Midway left him with no time for celebration. His mind was already turning to what came next. He had, after all, placed his trust in intelligence, in the fragments of codebreakers' whispers and deciphered messages that had led to the destruction of the Japanese fleet. The gamble was immense, the stakes beyond measure. But it had paid off, for enemy carriers sunk, and the balance of the Pacific had shifted. Now, Nimitz stood on the deck of the USS Enterprise, watching the sun begin its descent over the horizon, the quiet swells of the Pacific stretching into infinity. Victory had been achieved, but the war was far from over. The Japanese might have suffered a terrible blow, but the United States was far from assured of final victory. For Nimitz, the victory at Midway had given the U.S. Navy a breathing room, a window of opportunity that needed to be seized quickly. He knew the real battle was just beginning. The weight of command, of knowing that so many lives, both American and Japanese, had been irrevocably altered by the decisions he had made, did not sit easily on Nimitz's shoulders. The reports of the success at Midway were all over the radio and newspapers, but Nimitz remained focused, his eyes always on the next step. There would be no victory parades for him. The recognition came and went like fleeting shadows, but the lives lost and the paths still to be trodden were what weighed most heavily on his mind. He thought back to the decision to move his fleet toward Midway, to trust in Rockefeller's intelligence that had pointed to the island's vulnerability. There had been a great deal of uncertainty. The war was still in its early days, and the Pacific Fleet had been crippled at Pearl Harbor. The Yorktown had been heavily damaged, still undergoing repairs, and now it was only one of 3 carriers left in the fight. The fleet was outgunned, outnumbered, but Nimitz chose to act, to trust that the intelligence he had was correct, that the Japanese would move on Midway, and that this would be the opening America needed to change the tide of the war. As he read the reports from Midway, he understood what this victory meant, and he felt the weight of it. The strategy had been risky, a true gamble, and he had placed his faith in his intelligence officers, in the quiet work of men who had decoded the Japanese plans. But now, it was clear, they had won. The Japanese had lost 4 carriers, their pride and might in the Pacific. Midway, that small, isolated island, had become the cornerstone of American naval strategy. The Japanese had been lured into a trap, and the consequences would be felt for the rest of the war. Yet Nimitz was not one for self-congratulation. The success was not about him. It was about the men who had fought and sacrificed, the pilots who had carried out their missions knowing they might never return, the sailors who had held their positions in the heat of battle, and the officers who had given their lives for their country. For Nimitz, the victory was a collective achievement, and it was a testament to the strength of the American spirit, to the resilience that had been forged through years of hardship and struggle. As Nimitz sent his message to Washington, there was no fanfare. It was a simple statement, yet it carried the weight of what had been achieved. Our carriers have returned, and so has hope. It was a message that underscored the shifting tides of the Pacific. The U.S. Navy, once reeling from defeat, had now struck back. The balance of power had tilted, and the momentum was now on the side of the Allies. But Nimitz knew that this victory was not a guarantee of future success. The Japanese had lost some of their best carriers, but they still had strength, still had fighters, bombers, and a vast empire to defend. This was not the end of the war. It was only the beginning. Despite the exhaustion, the American forces kept moving forward. They had gained a foothold, but Nimitz understood that every success came with new challenges. Midway was a victory, but it was only one battle in a war that spanned the Pacific. There would be other islands to conquer, other fleets to fight, and more lives to sacrifice. The real test lay ahead, and Nimitz's calm, focused leadership would be the anchor the Navy needed to face what was to come. But for now, in the quiet after the battle, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Nimitz allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had guided the Pacific Fleet through the storm, through a gamble based on nothing but intellect and courage. The victory at Midway had shown the world that the United States would not bow, would not submit to the Japanese Empire. The Pacific War was far from over, but for the first time, the U.S. had momentum. In the annals of the Battle of Midway, the names of great commanders and strategies may stand out: Admiral Nimitz, Yamamoto, and the plans that led to the ultimate victory or defeat. But amid the grand narrative of war, there are the untold stories of the ordinary men whose courage, skill, and intuition turned the tide of battle. These men, pilots, sailors, and officers, embodied heroism not as larger-than-life figures, but as regular individuals who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. Midway, for all its importance, was not just a battle of military strategy, it was a battle of human will, where courage was tested in the heat of the moment. Among these men, 3 stories stand out: the stories of those who, against overwhelming odds, changed the course of history with their decisions and actions. Their heroism would be recorded, but it was not glory they sought. It was simply duty, and in that simple duty, they would define the very character of the American fight in the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the navigator who found the fleet. When Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey took off from the USS Enterprise on the morning of June 4, 1942, he didn't know that his intuition would make the difference between victory and defeat. McCluskey, the leader of a squadron of SBD Dauntless dive bombers, had been tasked with locating the Japanese fleet. It was a momentous responsibility, one that many would have found daunting. McCluskey's flight started out in disarray. His squadron was unable to find the Japanese fleet, and time was quickly running out. Fuel levels were low, and the clouds above the Pacific seemed to swallow up the Japanese fleet. In a moment of near despair, McCluskey made a choice: to change course based on instinct. He turned his aircraft northwest, flying into the clouds, trusting his gut rather than the maps or the briefings. After what seemed like an eternity, McCluskey finally spotted the Japanese fleet, sailing just below the horizon. "There it is," he called out. In that moment, his squadron was saved, and with it, the opportunity to launch the decisive attack that would destroy the Japanese carriers. The attack on the carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, that followed would change the course of the war. McCluskey's moment of faith in his own judgment would define him, earning him recognition and respect among his fellow pilots. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. While the skies above Midway were filled with bombers and fighters, one of the most devastating moments for the Americans came from the torpedo squadrons. Among the most heroic yet tragic stories was that of Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. On June 4, Gay and his squadron of torpedo bombers launched a desperate attack on the Japanese carriers. Their TBD Devastator aircraft, slow and outdated, were no match for the fast, agile Japanese fighters. One by one, the planes were gunned down by the enemy. Gay's squadron was virtually annihilated. Yet, despite the odds, Ensign Gay pressed on, flying straight into the fire, knowing that his attack could give the dive bombers the time they needed to strike. After the attack, Gay's plane was struck by enemy fire, and he was forced to ditch his aircraft in the Pacific Ocean. As he floated in the water, his fellow squadron members lost, and his plane sinking into the depths, Gay did not know if he would survive. But survive he did, and when he was rescued later that day, he was hailed as the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. The courage and resolve of Gay's squadron, even in the face of certain death, were remembered, but it was Gay himself who would carry the weight of their sacrifice. Dusty Clyce, the hero who struck 2 carriers in a day. Among the American dive bombers at Midway, Ensign Dusty Clyce would become one of the most celebrated pilots of the battle. His heroism, however, was marked by more than just bravery. It was a story of precision and skill, of making decisions in the heat of the moment that would lead to the destruction of 2 of Japan's most formidable carriers. Clyce, flying from the USS Yorktown, participated in the American dive bomber assault on the Japanese carriers. As he approached the Kaga, his bombs hit their mark, sending the ship into flames and sinking it in a matter of minutes. But Clyce did not stop there. After striking the Kaga, he immediately turned his attention to Akagi, Japan's flagship, and launched a second attack. His bombs once again hit their target, striking the Akagi and contributing to its eventual destruction. In a single day, Dusty Clyce had struck 2 carriers, playing an instrumental role in crippling the Japanese fleet. For his courage and skill, Clyce would become a symbol of the resilience and heroism of the American airmen at Midway. His name, though largely unknown to those who were not involved in the battle, became part of the greater story of Midway's success. He was one of the many who risked everything to strike a blow against an enemy that seemed invincible. Humanizing the statistics. In the grand narrative of war, numbers often overshadow the human beings behind them. The men who flew the planes, manned the guns, and carried out their orders, ordinary men in extraordinary moments, did not see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as men doing their duty, answering the call of their country, and surviving through whatever means necessary. The battle for Midway was not won by strategies alone, but by the ordinary individuals who dared to act in the face of overwhelming odds. Their actions were not calculated for fame or glory, but driven by a sense of duty to their comrades, their country, and their ideals. They knew the stakes. They understood the gravity of their mission. And in those critical moments, they did not hesitate. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, Ensign George Gay, and Ensign Dusty Clyce represent the faces of the American spirit in the Pacific, men who were not just soldiers, but husbands, sons, brothers, and fathers. Their courage was not just in their victories but in their willingness to fight for something greater than themselves, even at the cost of their own lives. In the wake of Midway, the storm that had threatened for months finally broke over Japan, but its true force came not in thunderous rage, but in a silent tremor that spread throughout the imperial halls of power. The news of the loss at Midway was delivered in hushed tones, censored before it could reach the public in full. The collapse of Japan's might, 4 of its finest carriers sunk, its pride shattered, had been too great a blow to allow for open discussion. In the streets of Tokyo, silence fell like a shroud, broken only by the whispers of men who dared to question a war they had once thought unassailable. For decades, Japan had known nothing but victory. From the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, the empire had risen steadily, defeating Russia, China, and other nations with speed and precision. The victories had come so frequently that they were assumed to be Japan's destiny, a divine mandate to rule the Pacific. But in the ruins of Midway, something far more profound had occurred. Japan had lost. The empire's invincibility was no more, and in its place, there was a deep, unsettling silence. At imperial headquarters in Tokyo, the high command was thrown into chaos. Admiral Yamamoto and his generals had believed that Midway would be the final stroke, a brilliant and decisive blow that would cripple the American fleet and secure Japan's dominance in the Pacific. Instead, it had become a crushing defeat, a catastrophe that left the Imperial Navy reeling. the Japanese high command, usually a united front, was now filled with unease. There were whispers behind closed doors. The Imperial Navy, long a symbol of power, was no longer infallible. Those who had once stood in awe of its might now questioned its ability to lead Japan to ultimate victory. Some, like Admiral Nagumo, the commander of the Japanese fleet at Midway, were humiliated, their decisions seen as flawed and inadequate. Others were privately concerned, sensing that the war, once seen as a simple victory parade, had now become an exhausting and uncertain battle for survival. Yet, there was no room for doubt within the public narrative. As in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese government sought to suppress the full extent of the loss. The public was told that the defeat at Midway was temporary, that it was only a minor setback in the grand scheme of the war. Propaganda remained the official face of Japan's narrative, reinforcing the myth of divine favor and Japanese superiority. The emperor, silent in his role as a symbol of unity, did not address the nation's loss publicly. Instead, the government tried to sustain morale with vague promises of revenge and resilience. The pride of the empire had been hurt, but it would rise again, they insisted. However, beneath the surface, the cracks began to show. Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's Pacific strategy, knew the war was no longer winnable in the way he had imagined. The loss of the carriers at Midway had weakened the Japanese Navy irreparably, and Yamamoto knew that the American industrial machine, once fully mobilized, could replace losses far more quickly than Japan could. He had gambled everything on a single battle, and the stakes had been too high. Now, he was left with a broken fleet and a shattered dream. In the aftermath of Midway, Yamamoto retreated into isolation. No longer the triumphant leader of a rising empire, he was now a man confronted by the limits of his vision. He had long believed that the Pacific could be won with daring strikes and bold tactics, but now, in the cold light of defeat, he understood that Japan's fate had been sealed by his own overconfidence. As he withdrew from public view, Yamamoto began to plan his revenge, though he knew in his heart that it would be impossible to undo the damage. There would be no quick victory, no strategic brilliance that could erase Midway. Instead, he began to think in terms of delayed strikes, attempting to stall the inevitable American counteroffensive, to buy time that Japan no longer had. Yamamoto understood that the battle for the Pacific had taken a decisive turn at Midway, and no amount of skill or ambition could alter that reality. There was no comfort in the quiet isolation of Yamamoto's retreat. The proud admiral, who had once moved with the confidence of a man destined to lead Japan to victory, now struggled with the bitter taste of defeat. His pride, like the pride of his nation, had been broken. The lessons of Midway, that overconfidence, arrogance, and a reliance on the illusion of invincibility were the surest paths to failure, had come too late for Yamamoto to reverse. In the aftermath of Midway's decisive victory, the Pacific seemed poised on the edge of a new chapter. The smoke from the burning wreckage of the Japanese carriers had only just begun to clear, and already, a new tide was rising in the west. The United States Navy, once reeling from the crushing blow at Pearl Harbor, was now the master of the Pacific, not by sheer force alone, but by the resilience and determination that had defined the nation since the very beginning of the war. Midway had been a turning point, yes, but more than that, it had become the spark that ignited the American war machine. The victory at Midway wasn't just a battle won, it was the reaffirmation of everything the U.S. stood for, the refusal to back down, the determination to fight in the face of overwhelming odds, and the ability to adapt and rise from the ashes of defeat. The U.S. Navy, its carriers still intact and its sailors brimming with newfound pride, now faced a daunting task, to rebuild and reassert control over the Pacific. The Japanese had been wounded, but not broken. Midway was a victory, but it was still only one battle in a vast, still raging war. America needed to seize the momentum, and fast. To do so, ship production accelerated at an unprecedented pace. The shipyards on the U.S. West Coast were transformed into factories of war, working around the clock to churn out the next generation of aircraft carriers. The Essex-class carriers, the first truly large and capable carriers in the U.S. fleet, began to take shape. The USS Essex, Independence, and Intrepid were built with incredible speed, their hulls rising from the steel of factories, their decks designed to accommodate the full weight of American naval power. These ships would be the backbone of the coming American offensive across the Pacific, each one a symbol of renewed purpose, of a nation rebuilt from the devastation of Pearl Harbor and the bitter lessons of Midway. In the months that followed, the naval expansion was nothing short of revolutionary. Each new carrier was a powerful testament to American ingenuity and the nation's unwavering commitment to victory. By the summer of 1943, the U.S. Navy's carrier fleet had swelled to a size Japan's Navy could never hope to match. 4 new Essex-class carriers were launched in rapid succession, with several more under construction. America's industrial might had been harnessed for war, and it was now churning out planes, ships, and weapons with the kind of speed that Japan could never match. Midway had electrified the nation. The war, which had once seemed so distant, now felt immediate. Public morale soared, and with it, the belief that victory was not just possible, but inevitable. For the American public, the victory at Midway was the proof that their sacrifices were not in vain, that the months of rationing, the losses of loved ones, and the constant threat of attack were all leading to something real. The American people rallied behind the war effort with renewed vigor, determined to finish what had been started. War production surged. American factories, once turned to civilian goods, were now pumping out ships, planes, and tanks as though there was no tomorrow. The workers' spirit was as unbreakable as the resolve of the soldiers in the field. Every man and woman knew they were part of something far greater than themselves. They were not just building weapons, they were building victory. The morale effect of Midway was undeniable. The Japanese, though still a powerful enemy, had been wounded. Their greatest weapons, their pride, and their confidence had been torn apart in a single, decisive moment. In Washington and across the nation, the message was clear: the United States was no longer on the defensive. It was time to take the fight to the enemy. The first signs of America's Pacific offensive began to take shape, not as a single thrust, but as a systematic advance, an island-hopping campaign that would leave Japan's defenses scattered and isolated. The first targets would be the Solomon Islands, then Guadalcanal, where the Japanese had established a forward base. The U.S. Marines would lead the charge, backed by the Navy's new carriers. But for now, the Pacific was still a battleground. Midway had given America a fighting chance, but the war was far from over. The Japanese were still formidable adversaries, and the path to victory would be long and bloody. Yet the Phoenix Fleet, America's new carrier strength, was now the beating heart of the Pacific War. The ships, powered by the spirit of those who had fought at Midway, would carry the fight to the Japanese home islands. The fire of victory had been forged in the flames of battle, and the American Navy was ready to carry that fire across the Pacific. Chapter 19: Echoes from the Abyss. The sunken carriers beneath the waves. Beneath the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, where the water is as deep and dark as time itself, lie the wrecks of 4 once mighty ships: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, carriers that had spearheaded Japan's dominance across the Pacific. Now, they rest silently on the ocean floor, their hulks twisted and broken, entombed in the deep. The once thriving decks that had hosted bustling air crews, pilots preparing for attack, and the roar of engines taking off into battle are now eerily still. The Akagi, once the flagship of the Japanese fleet, now lies in silent ruin. The Kaga, once a symbol of naval power, is a dark skeleton covered by the shifting sands of the ocean. The Soryu and Hiryu, with their proud flight decks, now remain as wrecks, reminders of a time when Japan's navy seemed untouchable. The ocean, in its infinite patience, has preserved the wreckage of these great ships. The waves and currents, though constantly in motion above, have frozen these ships in time, their destruction locked beneath the surface. Frozen moments of destruction, the final, catastrophic events that sent them to the depths are now lost to the passage of time, hidden beneath layers of saltwater, coral, and forgotten stories. As decades passed, the once pristine metal that had made up these ships began to corrode, but still, they remain, marked by time but preserved by the very nature of the sea. Marine life now grows over the twisted metal, colorful corals and sponges finding their home on what was once a tool of war. The quiet life of the deep slowly claims the legacy of these ships, turning them into strange, beautiful reefs that contrast sharply with their violent past. Fish swim through the wrecks, their movements as peaceful as the silence that now reigns. For divers who have ventured into the depths to visit these sunken monuments, there is a profound sense of reverence. To them, the wrecks are more than just remnants of a battle, they are the final resting places of the men who once sailed these ships. Divers who have descended to these watery graves have often called the wreckage a cathedral of ghosts. In the stillness of the ocean, it is as if the ships are preserved in a moment of reverence, the memory of the battle and the lives lost suspended in the quiet of the abyss. The sea, indifferent to human triumph and failure, has claimed its own tribute. The wrecks of these once proud ships now stand as tombstones to the empire that fell, and to the men who fought and died under the Japanese flag. The history of Midway is not just written in books or memorials, but in the silent, forgotten depths of the Pacific. In the years since the battle, the wrecks have become symbols of the cost of war, not just in terms of victory or defeat, but in the lives that are consumed in its wake. They stand as reminders of a time when an empire's arrogance met its reckoning, and of the thousands of sailors and pilots who gave their lives for that belief. The Pacific, once a symbol of vastness and opportunity, had become the final resting place for the heart of Japan's naval power. The sea does not distinguish between conquerors and the conquered, it simply preserves. The wrecks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu now rest beneath layers of water and history, silent, unmoving, as the tides of time continue to wash over them. Though the world above may have moved on, the ocean remembers, and in the deep, the ghosts of the past continue to drift. Chapter 20, The Shift in the Pacific. From defense to offense. The sun rose slowly over the Pacific in the wake of Midway, its first rays casting long shadows over the ocean as if to mark the beginning of a new era. For the first time since the war had begun, the Japanese advance came to an abrupt halt. The victory at Midway, swift, decisive, and brutal, had not only destroyed the heart of Japan's naval fleet but had also changed the very course of the war. Japan's expansion was no longer a matter of when, but how soon it would slow to a stop. Midway had dealt the Japanese Empire a blow from which it could not recover, and the momentum in the Pacific was shifting in favor of the United States. With the destruction of 4 of Japan's carrier ships, the Imperial Navy found itself desperately trying to regain lost ground while facing a fierce counterattack. The early days of the war, where Japan had dominated, now felt like a fading memory. The United States, reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor, was no longer just defending its territories. The Americans were now on the offensive, a change that would alter the Pacific War for the remainder of the conflict. For the United States Navy, Midway had proven one essential thing: the tide of the war could be turned. It wasn't just about holding out until reinforcements arrived. Now, America had found its footing. With its carriers intact and the ability to strike at Japan's heart, the U.S. Navy moved decisively into the role of the offensive power. The island-hopping campaign was born from the ashes of Midway. The plan was simple yet daring. Instead of charging directly at Japan, the United States would move from island to island, slowly cutting off Japan's supply routes and weakening their foothold in the Pacific one base at a time. The first target of this campaign was Guadalcanal, a small, seemingly insignificant island in the Solomon Islands, but one that would hold the key to opening the door for further offensive operations. The Japanese had established an airfield there, and controlling it would give them a strong foothold for future attacks. The U.S. Marines, landing in August 1942, would find themselves embroiled in one of the most brutal campaigns of the war. Guadalcanal would be a test of endurance, resolve, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for the chance to push the Japanese back. America's strategy shifted in those critical months after Midway. No longer merely fighting for survival, they were now fighting for control of the Pacific. The defeat at Midway had lifted the spirits of both the American public and military leadership, confirming what many had feared: the war could be won, but only if America could change the nature of the battle. No longer would they simply absorb Japan's strikes and hold their ground. Now, it was time for retribution. The Japanese tide, once so powerful and unyielding, had begun to recede. And in its place, an American storm was gathering, a storm that would bring the Pacific War to Japan's doorstep. The shift from defense to offense also marked a significant change in American military thinking. The lessons learned at Midway had taught the U.S. Navy that intelligence, coordination, and speed were just as important as firepower. The carrier, once considered a supporting ship in naval warfare, had now become the key weapon of the Pacific. The aircraft carrier would carry the fight to Japan's doorstep, its planes striking with speed and precision, just as the American dive bombers had done at Midway. The new strategy was to use air superiority as a foundation, allowing the U.S. forces to bypass heavily defended islands and take others through quick, decisive action. Midway had also highlighted Japan's overextension, their inability to replace the massive losses they had suffered. For every American ship lost, the Japanese had to replace 4, and their industrial infrastructure simply couldn't keep pace. The United States, on the other hand, was capable of building and replacing ships and planes at a pace the Japanese could not match. The loss of Midway meant more than just the destruction of ships. It was the beginning of the slow unraveling of Japan's ability to sustain the war. The war in the Pacific was no longer a matter of defending American territories and holding off Japan. Now, it was a matter of pushing forward, reclaiming lost islands, and cutting off Japan's ability to fight. Every victory at places like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and the Gilberts brought the American forces closer to their final objective, the Japanese home islands. Each island taken was not just a military victory, it was a blow to Japan's ability to continue the war. By the fall of 1943, the tide of war had irrevocably changed. The Pacific, once a Japanese-controlled domain, had become an American battleground. Japan's ambitions had been halted, and now it was only a matter of time before their empire began to collapse under the weight of the American offensive. The American storm had gathered at Midway. And now, with its momentum secured, it would sweep across the Pacific, taking back the islands, striking at Japan's heart, and pushing the Japanese empire toward its inevitable defeat. The victory at Midway was celebrated with an outpouring of national pride. The American people had been waiting for a sign of hope, and Midway delivered it. For Japanese carriers were sunk, their pride and strength obliterated in a single, swift strike. The American fleet, once crippled at Pearl Harbor, had emerged from the ashes of defeat to deliver a decisive blow to Japan's navy. For the first time in the war, Japan's expansion had been halted, and the momentum shifted in America's favor. Yet amid the triumph, there were shadows that could not be ignored. The cost of victory was written not just in ships lost, but in the lives that had been sacrificed to achieve it. As the American public reveled in the success, the true toll of Midway began to come into clearer view. Squadrons that had been sent into the skies over the island would never return. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighter pilots had flown with courage and precision, but many would not see the end of the day. Sailors, too, had been caught in the fires of battle, men who had stood at their posts, doing their duty, only to be swallowed by the chaos of war. The survivors of the battle, those who had managed to return to their carriers, could not shake the memory of the men who had not. Faces haunted them, the faces of those who had flown beside them, who had smiled in the days before, only to be lost in the smoke and fire of the battle. The voices of fallen comrades echoed in their minds, their last words and their last looks frozen in time. These men were not just fighters, they were brothers, sons, and fathers. They had come to the Pacific to defend their country, to answer the call. But now, many of them would never return to see their homes again. For the commanders, the victory at Midway was bittersweet. Admiral Nimitz, the steady hand at the helm of the Pacific Fleet, had guided the U.S. forces through the battle with calm precision, but even he was not immune to the weight of the cost. Behind closed doors, he and his officers reflected on the true nature of the victory. They had struck a blow to Japan's heart, but at what cost? Was it luck that the Japanese fleet had been caught unaware? Was it courage that had driven the American forces to strike so decisively? Or was it providence, the idea that fate itself had stepped in to shape the outcome? Each commander knew the truth: no victory in war is ever purely earned. There was always a price, and that price was paid not just in strategic gains, but in lives lost, in broken families, in dreams shattered. The survivors of the battle, while proud of their success, could not shake the faces of their fallen comrades from their thoughts. The pilots of Torpedo Squadron 8, who had launched a desperate attack against the Japanese carriers, knew they were walking into certain death. Their planes were outdated, their chances slim, but they had pressed on anyway, knowing that their sacrifice would buy time for the dive bombers to strike. When they returned to their ships, only one man from their squadron survived. For him, the victory at Midway was forever intertwined with the memory of his fallen comrades. One pilot, Lieutenant Albert H. Al Lutz, had returned from his final mission to find his ship, the USS Yorktown, sinking beneath the waves. His eyes were filled with exhaustion and sorrow. He was a survivor, but he knew the cost of survival. His eyes scanned the sea, looking for something, anything, to hold on to. But the only thing that remained was the memory of the men who had flown alongside him. On the USS Enterprise, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, who had led the dive bombers that found the Japanese fleet, knew his victory had come at a price. His squadron had been among the first to strike the Japanese carriers, but many of the planes had been lost in the attack. He could still hear the roar of the Japanese fighters and the terrifying realization that they had been outnumbered. Victory, in McCluskey's mind, was not a celebration of strength, but a somber acknowledgement of the cost of war. He would return to his country as a hero, but the memory of those he had lost would haunt him forever. For the American public, Midway had become a symbol of national pride and a clear signal that the U.S. was no longer on the defensive. Victory was now within reach, and the dream of defeating Japan felt achievable. But for those who fought at Midway, victory was never a simple matter. It was a dark triumph, where the sacrifices of men and the cost of war weighed heavily in the hearts of those who had lived to tell the story. The true cost of victory, the burden of the dead, was clear in the hearts of the survivors. The victory at Midway was not just a military achievement, it was a personal reckoning for those who had fought, for those who had lost comrades, for those who would never forget the faces of the men they had left behind. The smoke of Midway still hung in the air when the military analysts began their work. In the wake of such a decisive battle, the lessons to be learned were far more important than the celebrations that would follow. while America's victory was clear, the path to that victory was far from simple. The tactical and strategic decisions that had led to the destruction of the Japanese fleet were still being studied, dissected, and evaluated by the men whose job it was to turn these lessons into a foundation for future victories. In the quiet aftermath, military experts began to sift through the rubble of the battle, reflecting on what went right, what almost went wrong, and what could have been done differently. The victory at Midway had been decisive, but it was also close. One more misstep, one more tactical failure, and the Japanese could have turned the tables on the Americans. The fragility of success was now clear to everyone. The first lesson that emerged from Midway was the absolute importance of intelligence. The Americans had cracked the Japanese naval code, a feat that seemed improbable and impossible before the war, but one that had changed everything. This intelligence allowed the Americans to not only anticipate the Japanese strike on Midway, but to set a trap that would leave the Japanese fleet vulnerable. It was not sheer luck that had turned the tide, but months of painstaking work by American cryptanalysts who had pieced together the puzzle of Japan's plans. The victory had been built on information, on knowing the enemy's intentions before they made their move. Timing was the second critical element. The American forces knew when the Japanese would strike, and they were ready. But just as important was the timing of the American attack. The aircraft carriers, still operating under the shadow of the earlier attack at Pearl Harbor, had arrived at Midway just in time to launch a counterstrike. The American dive bombers, flying under difficult conditions, had made their strikes at precisely the right moment. The Japanese, caught off guard, had no time to react. Their planes, still being prepped for takeoff, were caught in mid-flight, an almost impossible advantage for the Americans. Flexibility was the third lesson that emerged from Midway. The Japanese had planned their assault carefully, a coordinated strike from multiple directions designed to overwhelm Midway's defenses. However, what the Japanese did not account for was the Americans' ability to adapt. The U.S. pilots, who had initially struggled to find the Japanese fleet, eventually found it using intuition and sheer persistence. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, they refused to abandon their mission. The ability to adjust to changing circumstances, to act in the face of uncertainty, had been critical to their success. It was a lesson that would be carried forward in every engagement to come, from the Solomons to Okinawa. The fourth lesson, and perhaps the most important, was the power of air superiority. The carriers, once dismissed as supporting vessels in naval warfare, had become the dominant force in the Pacific. The devastating attacks by dive bombers at Midway had proved this. The aircraft carrier, armed with bombers, fighters, and torpedo planes, was now the center of naval warfare. No longer were battleships the backbone of a fleet. It was now the aircraft carrier that would dictate the terms of engagement. The fate of the Pacific had been decided not by battleships, but by planes, launched from the decks of the ships themselves. As the days and weeks passed, the battle was analyzed again and again. Every move, every tactical shift, was examined by military thinkers. The lessons of Midway would shape the next phase of the Pacific War. America had learned from the loss at Pearl Harbor, and now, with Midway, it had learned again. Intelligence, timing, and flexibility were the keys to future success. Midway had not just been a victory, it had been an evolution in naval warfare. The victory at Midway was the first major step in the island-hopping campaign that would see the United States push back the Japanese and reclaim the Pacific. The lesson of Midway would define how the war would be fought from that point on. It was no longer just about holding ground. It was about moving forward, about seizing the initiative, about fighting smarter and faster than the enemy. The United States was no longer reacting to Japanese moves. It was now the one dictating the terms of battle. After the dust settled on the Battle of Midway, the tides of war had changed dramatically. But the true impact of the battle was not just in the number of ships sunk or the tactics employed. The war for the hearts and minds of the world was only beginning. The military victories and defeats would be remembered, but how they were perceived, and how they were presented to the people of both nations, would play a pivotal role in shaping the ongoing conflict. In Washington, Midway was portrayed as redemption, a moment when the U.S. rose from the ashes of Pearl Harbor to deliver a crushing blow to the Japanese Navy. The American public, still reeling from the shock of the surprise attack in December, had been desperate for a sign that the war was not a lost cause. Midway provided that hope. The victory was broadcast across the nation as proof of American resilience and the overwhelming might of the U.S. war machine. The American government's propaganda machine worked in overdrive, ensuring that Midway would not just be remembered as a military victory, but as a symbol of America's indomitable spirit. Posters, films, and speeches were quickly disseminated, emphasizing the triumph of the United States over Japan. The battle became not just a military achievement, but a moral victory, a righteous cause vindicated. It was framed as the turning point, the moment when the United States, once wounded, now stood ready to reclaim its place as the dominant power in the Pacific. Every narrative surrounding the victory was crafted to inspire national pride, galvanizing citizens for the long road ahead. By contrast, the Japanese reaction was markedly different. The loss at Midway was something that could not be openly discussed, especially in the immediate aftermath. The defeat was too severe, too damaging to the national psyche. Japan had been on the march for months, and Midway was the first sign that their military dominance could be undone. The Japanese government, determined to keep morale high, buried the loss under layers of euphemism and silence. The official narrative was that the battle had been a minor setback, a necessary part of the larger struggle to create the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. There was little to no acknowledgement of the true scale of the defeat in public broadcasts or news outlets. Instead, Japanese propaganda rewrote the meaning of the loss. Public speeches and films portrayed the battle as a temporary challenge that would soon be overcome. In place of acknowledgement, the government emphasized Japan's continued strength and the inevitable triumph of their cause. Posters of the emperor, surrounded by images of battle flags and noble warriors, continued to dominate public spaces, reinforcing the notion of Japan's divine destiny and superiority. The memory of Midway was shaped not as a loss, but as a learning opportunity, one that would lead to a stronger, more unified Japan. The contrast between these two nations' narratives was stark, but they shared a common goal: controlling the perception of the war. Each side needed to sustain morale, to keep its people believing in the righteousness of the cause, even as the tides of war began to shift. For the Japanese, maintaining the illusion of invincibility was crucial to keeping the population's faith in the leadership of the emperor and the military. For the Americans, it was about building hope and unity in a time when the war seemed long and uncertain. The battle for public perception was not only about what happened on the battlefield, but how those events were framed and understood by the people at home. The media, propaganda outlets, and official communications became as much a part of the war as the battles themselves. Each nation needed to create a narrative that would inspire and sustain its citizens, even as the outcome of the war seemed uncertain. In both countries, the battle for perception reached far beyond the headlines. It was a psychological struggle, fought with words as much as weapons. The battle for control over the truth became just as important as the military victories. Both sides fought to shape the narrative, to define the meaning of defeat and victory, and to ensure that their people remained committed to the cause. In this war of perception, the true cost of Midway was not just in the ships sunk and the lives lost, but in the psychological toll the defeat and victory would take on the soldiers, sailors, and civilians alike. As the war continued, the battle for hearts and minds would only intensify. The victories of the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, would be framed by both sides in ways that suited their larger narratives. Every sacrifice made, every victory won, would carry with it the weight of the stories told. These stories would not only shape the outcome of the war, but also how history would remember it. Tone, manipulated truth, the war for hearts and minds. The narratives constructed on both sides were not just about facts, but about shaping the future, ensuring the belief in the cause, and winning the war within the minds of the people. The Pacific, once dominated by the thunderous guns of battleships, had witnessed a shift in the tides of naval warfare. The Battle of Midway, though a victory of monumental proportions, had not only marked a turning point in the Pacific War, but it had also redrawn the very definition of sea power. For decades, naval strategy had been defined by the colossal, gun-laden battleships, massive behemoths that represented a nation's might. Their towering turrets had commanded the seas, their armored hulls the epitome of naval strength. But Midway shattered that perception forever. The battle had proved something simple, yet profound: the age of the aircraft carrier had begun. At Midway, for Japanese carriers, the very heart of their naval fleet, were sunk in a single day. These ships, once seen as virtually unsinkable, were obliterated by American dive bombers and torpedo planes launched from aircraft carriers. The very ships that had been meant to establish Japanese dominance in the Pacific were now part of the seafloor, consumed by fire and chaos. The battleships, with their heavy guns and armored decks, had been rendered nearly irrelevant, while the carrier, fast, flexible, and capable of projecting power across vast distances, emerged as the undisputed ruler of the waves. The implications of this shift were immense. At Midway, the carriers had decisively defeated the Japanese fleet not by direct cannon fire, but through the superior mobility of their air wings. The aircraft carrier was no longer just a support vessel, it had become the primary weapon of naval warfare. The battle had shown that the control of the skies over the sea was now the key to dominance. The carriers could strike at the heart of an enemy fleet, from hundreds of miles away, and deliver death with precision and efficiency. In the aftermath of the battle, the battleship, once the symbol of naval strength, began its slow fade into obsolescence. Naval historians, looking back on the events of Midway, would come to see it not just as a military victory, but as a watershed moment in the evolution of warfare. It was the dawn of a new kind of war, one that would be fought in the skies, and the air wing would be the true determinant of victory or defeat. The importance of air superiority could no longer be disputed. The carriers now had the ability to launch aircraft at will, to strike from vast distances, and to evade enemy attacks by constantly moving across the ocean. The old way of naval combat, with battleships closing in and exchanging fire, seemed archaic in the wake of Midway's lessons. Instead of massive ships trading broadsides, the future of warfare was about swift, aerial strikes, and the ability to bring devastating power to bear from miles away. For the United States, this shift came at a pivotal moment. The USS Yorktown, though heavily damaged during the battle, would go on to be a symbol of the resilience and power of American carrier forces. As new carriers like the USS Essex, Intrepid, and Independence came online, the United States Navy would see its power in the Pacific multiply exponentially. The loss of the battleships that had once dominated the seas was compensated by the arrival of a new class of ships that were more agile, more lethal, and more versatile than anything the world had seen before. The Pacific War, which had been primarily a contest of battleships and surface warfare, was now entirely defined by the carrier battle. The ability to strike at the heart of the enemy fleet from the sky meant that sight lines and direct engagements were no longer the determining factors of success. Instead, it was about intelligence, timing, and aircraft readiness. Looking back, naval historians would recognize Midway not just as a victory for the American Navy, but as the end of an era. The great, lumbering battleships that had once ruled the seas would now be relegated to the pages of history, replaced by the speed and flexibility of the aircraft carrier. The lessons of Midway would shape the naval strategy of the post-war world, and its effects would be felt long after the guns fell silent. The Battle of Midway had not only reshaped the strategic landscape of the Pacific, it had redefined naval warfare itself. Where the battleships had once been the ultimate weapon, the aircraft carrier now stood as the unquestioned king of the ocean. The men who fought at Midway had changed the course of history, not only by defeating a powerful enemy, but by ushering in a new era of warfare. The battle had proven that in the future, it was not guns or armor that would decide the outcome of a naval war, but aircraft, launched from the decks of ships that could be anywhere, strike anywhere, and leave devastation in their wake. The victory at Midway had come at a terrible cost. For all the American triumph, for the 4 Japanese carriers that had been sunk, in the subsequent shift in the tide of the war, there were men who would never return. Their names would be written into the annals of history, their actions forever etched in the narrative of a nation that had fought to survive. Yet they would remain unseen, their stories told only in fragments, in the quiet whispers of their families, and in the empty spaces left behind by their absence. These were the men whose faces never graced the victory parades, whose families never received the final embrace of their sons or husbands. They were the aviators, the pilots, the torpedo bombers, and the fighter crews who had launched into battle with courage that could not be measured. They had given their all at Midway, and in doing so, had paid the ultimate price. Many would be remembered by the medals awarded posthumously, but the stories of their sacrifice were not to be confined to military honors. They were men who had lived, had hopes, dreams, and families, and who had given everything for a cause greater than themselves. The names of the lost pilots were not just numbers in a report, they were faces, and the stories of those who had known them would carry their memories forward. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, had come back with the weight of a squadron's sacrifice on his shoulders. But the others, the pilots of VT-6, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, were not so lucky. Their planes had been shot down, some in flames, others never seen again. The ocean claimed them, swallowing their wreckage and their courage in its depths. The crash of a torpedo bomber into the sea was often the last thing those men ever saw, an eternal reminder that war, though fought for victory, also demanded sacrifice beyond measure. Among those lost were men like Lieutenant Albert L. Lutz and Lieutenant Harold L. Ogg, both of whom had taken to the skies that day, knowing their chances of survival were slim. Lutz, in particular, had flown in the desperate attacks against the Japanese carriers, only to be hit by enemy fire and sent into a death spiral. He never made it home, and his family back in Texas would be left with a final letter they could not read again. The letters from the front were filled with hope and love, words that would be read by those left behind, long after the war had moved on. The men who wrote those letters were not thinking of their deaths, they were thinking of the future, of the families they might return to, of the simple joys they dreamed of once the war was won. In one letter, a young pilot wrote, "I don't know when I'll be back, but I'll be home soon. I miss you so much. We'll be fine, just keep the faith. I'll do my job, and I know you'll keep the home fires burning." But for many families, those letters would be their final words from their loved ones. They would be carried back, unopened for days, weeks, sometimes months, until the inevitable news came. And even then, when the telegram arrived, it would often be too late. The final message was nothing more than the ink on a letter that had been folded and placed in a drawer. The grief was quiet, a wound that would never heal. The victory at Midway was not complete for the mothers who would never hear their sons' voices again, or for the wives who would raise children without their fathers. The fathers who waited by the window, hoping their sons would come back, would die themselves never knowing whether their hopes had been realized. But in the face of that sorrow, there was remembrance. A memorial at sea was held for the men who had fallen at Midway, not just as heroes, but as men whose courage defined the very essence of what it meant to be an American soldier. Wreaths were dropped from aircraft over the Pacific, the ocean becoming a final resting place for those who had never returned. For the survivors, it was the only tribute they could give to their fallen comrades, to return to the very battlefield where they had fought, and to honor them in silence. The silent echoes of those lost would resonate in the hearts of their families forever. The men of Midway, the pilots, the sailors, the soldiers, were not just numbers in a report. They were human beings who left behind lives and dreams. Their legacy was not in medals or formal recognition, but in the lives they touched and the families who carried their memory. In the years to come, as the survivors of Midway would reflect on their victory, they would always remember those who had been left behind. The cost of victory, they knew, was not measured in ships or planes, but in the men who had given everything. The true measure of Midway was not found in statistics, but in the quiet remembrance of those who had flown into battle, knowing the odds, and paid the ultimate price for the cause of freedom. The smoke from the burning wreckage of the Japanese carriers at Midway had barely dissipated before a new spirit began to stir across the United States. The news, carried on the winds of victory, had ignited a flicker of hope that had long been absent from the American public. For months, America had been reeling from the devastation of Pearl Harbor and the subsequent Japanese advances across the Pacific. The nation had faced defeat after defeat, watching as Japan extended its reach from Southeast Asia to the Solomon Islands. But now, Midway had changed everything. The once undefeatable Japanese Navy had been brought to its knees, and America had regained its strength, its resolve. The victory at Midway was not just a military triumph, it was a symbol of resilience, of a nation determined not to surrender. In the aftermath, the American public felt a wave of renewed confidence. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered in a single, decisive battle. The tide of the war had turned, and the United States was no longer on the defensive. Instead, the American war machine had found its momentum, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose. Across the country, factories roared to life. The industrial awakening that President Roosevelt had predicted after the attack on Pearl Harbor had come to fruition, but now, it was no longer a matter of sustaining war efforts, it was about winning. The steel mills, shipyards, and aircraft plants that had once been idle or converted for wartime production now hummed with the energy of progress. Workers poured into factories from all walks of life, men, women, and children, all united by the knowledge that they were part of something unstoppable. The country was rebuilding, not just its military, but its spirit. As the shipyards in cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Seattle continued to build new carriers, destroyers, and submarines, there was a palpable sense of unity and purpose. The once gloomy outlook had shifted. The American people, who had known only the agony of defeat for months, now saw the light at the end of the tunnel. The victory at Midway had proven that Japan's advance could be stopped, and the United States was more than capable of retaking the Pacific. The American war effort had moved from a struggle for survival to a determined campaign for victory. The surge in recruitment was one of the most visible signs of this newfound confidence. Young men, who had once hesitated to enlist or had been unsure of their role in the conflict, now stood in long lines at recruiting offices across the nation. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered, and in its place was a sense that victory was not only possible but now inevitable. The young soldiers, sailors, and airmen who had previously feared the strength of the Japanese fleet now marched off with renewed purpose, ready to join the fight in the Pacific. The courage and skill of the American pilots and sailors at Midway had demonstrated that it was not Japan, but the United States that held the upper hand. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt could feel the shift in the nation's mood. The strain of the past few months, the pressure of mounting losses, the anxiety over the future of the war, had been replaced by something much more powerful. Roosevelt's quiet satisfaction after Midway was not born of boasting or grand speeches, but of a silent acknowledgement that his faith in America's ability to turn the tide had been proven right. To his closest advisors, Roosevelt simply said, "Now we begin to win." The simplicity of the statement reflected the confidence that now defined the nation's war strategy. Roosevelt had always known that the United States had the industrial capacity, the technological advantage, and the human will to defeat its enemies. But Midway had been the first sign that, despite the setbacks, victory was attainable. It was not just a battle won, it was the beginning of a campaign that would push Japan out of the Pacific and eventually lead to the destruction of the Axis. As the months passed, the American war machine continued to accelerate. The factories hummed, the planes flew, and the American military began its island-hopping campaign, taking back territory lost in the early days of the war. Each victory, from the Solomons to Guadalcanal, built upon the foundation that Midway had laid. The confidence gained from the battle flowed through every American soldier, sailor, and airman. And for the first time since Pearl Harbor, there was a sense of hope, the belief that Japan could be defeated, that the United States could win the Pacific War. But even as the country celebrated, there was still the long road ahead. Midway was not the end of the war, but the first step in a journey that would cost millions of lives and stretch over thousands of miles of hostile terrain. But for the first time, there was a shared belief that the path ahead could lead to victory. The victory at Midway had given the United States not just a strategic advantage, but a new sense of purpose, a rebirth of national morale, a realization that the war was no longer about survival, but about total victory. In the days following the devastating defeat at Midway, Japan's military and political leaders were thrust into a quiet storm, one far more potent than any battle they had fought. In the darkened rooms of the Imperial Navy's command center in Tokyo, behind closed doors and under the weight of secrecy, the true cost of Midway began to settle in. But within these rooms, the silence of the defeated admirals was deafening. The truth of what had happened at Midway, the loss of 4 fleet carriers, the decimation of Japan's offensive power, and the death of hundreds of experienced airmen, was kept from the Japanese public for months. The emperor remained shielded from the full extent of the defeat. It was not out of concern for his well-being, but to prevent the entire nation from coming face to face with the reality of a war that had begun to spiral toward collapse. The military hierarchy, long accustomed to victories, now turned inward, choosing silence over admission. There was no public outcry, no rush to address the loss in the media. Instead, the focus was on maintaining national morale and preserving the illusion that Japan's destiny was still in its own hands. In the inner sanctums of Japan's military leadership, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Japan's early victories, had always been a man of purpose. He had calculated every move in the Pacific, believing in the supremacy of the Imperial Navy and Japan's divine right to rule the seas. But the aftermath of Midway shattered his confidence. Yamamoto, once so sure of Japan's military might, now found himself facing the ugly truth that he had, in fact, awakened a sleeping giant. In a series of secret meetings in Tokyo, the high command gathered, their faces somber, their voices low. Yamamoto's admission was brief, but it carried the weight of a nation's realization. "We woke the sleeping giant." It was not said loudly, nor was it met with immediate agreement. Instead, it was a bitter whisper, spoken in a room where military pride and shame were intertwined. Yamamoto knew that the Japanese Navy had overreached, that the failure to decisively crush America's fleet had now made the war unwinnable. In those moments of silence, even Yamamoto's unshakable belief in Japan's superiority began to crumble. The weight of this realization did not come with surrender. The Japanese military was far too proud for that. Even as their empire faltered, there was still a strong sense of defiance in the high command. The leaders who had once projected absolute certainty now faced a fractured empire, and their path forward was one of desperation, not calculated victory. The need for revenge, for reclaiming lost honor, became their primary motivator. Meanwhile, the Emperor Hirohito was quietly informed of the outcome of the battle, but the full truth of Midway was omitted from the official reports. The Emperor, ever the figurehead of the Japanese Empire, was told only what his advisors believed he should hear, that Japan had endured a temporary setback. The reality, that the Japanese Navy had been dealt a blow it could not recover from, was too much to bear, even for an emperor who had witnessed years of victories. For the Japanese public, the loss of Midway would remain a secret for some time, hidden beneath layers of official propaganda. The morale of the people would be safeguarded through the creation of new stories, that the war was still going according to plan, that Japan would soon recover its strength. This carefully crafted illusion of invincibility would become the nation's shield, even as the cracks in its empire widened. The high command knew the truth, but they were determined to keep it hidden. Midway had not been a minor setback, as they claimed, it had been a turning point, one that could no longer be ignored. Japan's overwhelming dominance in the Pacific had been broken, and the Americans were now on the offensive. Yet, despite this realization, the leadership held to their dignity of denial, clinging to the belief that Japan could still turn the tide, that their spirit and will to fight could overcome the material losses. The military leadership's quiet retreat into denial was not a sign of weakness, but of unwavering pride. They refused to accept the reality of their failure and, in doing so, they continued to prepare for the next phase of the war, a phase in which they would attempt to regain momentum, even as the foundation of their empire began to crumble. Yamamoto, isolated in his quarters, would plan for the future, knowing deep inside that his earlier plans had been deeply flawed, but still driven by the hope of revenge, of victory that might right the wrongs of Midway. The Pacific, vast and unyielding, has always been a place where time seems to stretch beyond human reckoning. It is a world of endless horizons, where the sky and sea merge into one and where the past often slips quietly beneath the waves. But for those who fought and died at Midway, the ocean has become sacred ground, a living, breathing memorial to the lives lost and the history made. Years after the battle, the sailors and aviators who survived would return to the site of the confrontation, not in the hope of reclaiming victory or in search of glory, but in search of something more profound. Midway, that small, desolate speck of land, had become for them not just a battlefield, but a place of remembrance, a place where the ghosts of the fallen still lingered, and the echoes of battle never truly faded. Survivors would describe the return to Midway as an experience of quiet reverence, of standing on the land that had borne witness to such sacrifice and courage. For some, the visit was a pilgrimage of sorts, a way to honor the comrades who had never come home, to stand where so many had given their lives, and to confront the ghosts that still haunted their dreams. Those who stood on the beaches of Midway often felt the weight of the ocean's eternal embrace. The island, now a quiet military outpost, stood in stark contrast to the violence of that summer day in 1942. The waves, rolling gently onto the shore, seemed to carry with them the weight of memory, not the memory of victory, but the memory of human loss. The ocean that had once been a place of battle now became a grave, holding the bodies of those who had fallen. Yet, it was also a guardian, sheltering their stories in its depths, where only the fish in the current could hear the silent whispers of their names. Midway had become sacred ground, not because of the military significance it held, but because it had come to represent something far deeper, the human cost of war, the lives that had been given in service to a cause that could never truly be won without sacrifice. The battle's outcome had marked the turning of the tide in the Pacific War, but the victory came at a cost, the souls of the men who had fought and died there. For the survivors, returning to Midway was often a deeply emotional experience. Dreams of fire and water haunted them, dreams of the explosion of bombs, the roar of planes diving from the sky, the screams of men who had disappeared beneath the waves. It was as though the very water had absorbed the pain of the battle, holding the memories of every plane that fell, every sailor who was swallowed by the ocean. One survivor, Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, would later reflect on his return to Midway. When I stood there on the beach, I could hear them, the men who didn't make it. It wasn't in words, but in the wind. It was like the island was speaking for them. It's a strange thing, to stand where you fought, where you lost, and feel them all around you. The ocean never forgets. And it remembers them. Nature, in all its indifference, remained unmoved by human events. The ocean, with its infinite waves, continued to lap at the shore, as it always had, unaffected by the tides of history that had come and gone. To the sea, Midway was just another place, another piece of the Pacific, nothing more than a dot on the map. Yet to the men who had fought there, it was far more. It was the place where destiny had been decided, where lives had been shaped and shattered. It was a sacred space, where history had turned, and where the ghosts of the past could never fully be laid to rest. In the end, Midway would not just live in the pages of history books. It would live in the memories of those who had fought, in the dreams of the men who had returned, and in the deep, quiet heart of the ocean that had witnessed it all. The sea, with its vast and eternal silence, would hold the memory of the lost, of those who gave their all in the skies and on the waters, and of the struggle that had shaped the Pacific conflict. The ocean remembered, not just the battle, but the men who had fought it. The waves whispered their names, and the sea held their spirits within its depths, guarding them with a reverence that time could never erase. Midway would be remembered, not just as a victory, but as the final resting place for those who had sacrificed everything. And in the quiet after the storm, the ocean became the eternal witness to a battle that had shaped the future of the world. The dawn after the battle at Midway was not just a new day in the calendar of war. It marked the beginning of a new phase in the Pacific conflict, one where Japan, for the first time, would be forced into defensive positions. The decisive defeat of its carrier fleet, once the cornerstone of its naval power, had shattered the confidence of the Imperial Navy. The illusion of invincibility, once the cornerstone of Japan's strategy, had been pierced by American intelligence and daring. The tide had finally turned, and from that moment onward, the Japanese would no longer hold the initiative in the Pacific. For the Allied forces, Midway was more than just a tactical victory. It was a strategic pivot. No longer fighting to hold their ground, the United States and its allies were now in the position of taking the war directly to the enemy. The path to victory in the Pacific no longer stretched across a series of defensive battles to preserve their territories. Instead, the Allies now set the course of the conflict. The stage was set for the island-hopping campaign, a series of coordinated offensives that would push the Japanese back, island by island, toward the very heart of their empire. From Guadalcanal to the Philippines, and eventually to the islands closer to Japan's doorstep, the Allied forces began a methodical march, taking strategically important islands and denying Japan crucial resources and staging points. These islands, once considered insignificant to the larger war, were now crucial stepping stones in the race to bring the war to Japan's home islands. With each island that fell, the U.S. Navy gained more ground, and more airfields, positioning itself ever closer to Japan itself. The victory at Midway gave the U.S. Navy and its allied forces the strategic initiative they had long lacked. No longer was America simply reacting to Japan's attacks. Now, the U.S. would take the fight to the Japanese, forcing them to stretch their resources thinner and thinner as they struggled to defend their sprawling empire. The psychological shift was profound. The fear that had once paralyzed American strategy, the fear of Japan's dominance, the fear of the war's endless nature, began to fade. What replaced it was inevitability. Inevitability came from the realization that, for the first time since Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor, Japan was on the defensive. Midway had shown that their fleet could be broken, their lines could be pushed, and their sense of invulnerability was a lie. As the Japanese military scrambled to rebuild its fleet and shore up defenses across the Pacific, the United States began to move forward with greater and greater confidence. The defeat at Midway, while devastating to Japan, had set in motion a chain of events that would take the Allies into the heart of the Pacific. The next major offensive would be Guadalcanal, an island in the Solomon Islands that had strategic importance due to its proximity to vital shipping lanes and Japanese strongholds. The U.S. Marines were the first to land on Guadalcanal, and though the fighting there was brutal and costly, the Allies were no longer fighting to survive. They were fighting to win. At the same time, the U.S. Navy began a series of counterattacks across the Pacific, targeting the Japanese strongholds in the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, and eventually the Philippines. These offensives were carefully coordinated, each attack carefully planned to follow up on the victory at Midway. With the loss of the Japanese carriers, the U.S. Navy was now the dominant force on the seas, able to project power across a much larger swath of ocean. As the Japanese faced one defeat after another, their naval forces struggled to regroup. Their once unified fleets were now spread thin across multiple theaters, each campaign weakening them further. For the Japanese, Midway had marked the end of their offensive capabilities. They could no longer afford to continue expanding, now they were forced to defend what they had already conquered. And with each island the Allies captured, Japan's defensive perimeter grew weaker and weaker. The psychological shift among the Japanese was palpable. The once confident and relentless Imperial Navy was now reeling. For the first time, Japan faced the sobering realization that their defeat at Midway was not just a setback, it was the beginning of the end of their empire. Their forces would no longer operate with the same freedom they had before Midway, their naval superiority was gone, and the Japanese people, who had long been told they were invincible, began to sense the looming inevitability of their empire's collapse. For the United States, the change in momentum was just as profound. The fear of Japan's overwhelming might had been replaced with the certainty that victory was achievable. Midway had ignited a renewed sense of purpose and confidence in the American military and in the American public. The defeat of Japan was no longer a distant hope, it was a tangible goal that could be reached. The United States had tasted victory, and it would not let that victory slip away. In the months following Midway, American warships, bombers, and Marines continued to push forward, gaining ground steadily. The battle-hardened troops and sailors who had fought at Midway now carried that momentum with them, making each victory feel like another step closer to ultimate triumph. The Pacific War, once an impossible struggle, was now a campaign that could be won, not just by force, but by resolve, strategy, and momentum. The tide of war had been reversed. From Midway, the United States would move from defense to offense, and the Pacific would no longer be the Japanese tide, it would be an American storm. Midway would be remembered as more than just a battle in the vast expanse of the Pacific, it would be the true turning point of the war, the pivotal moment when the fate of nations shifted and the course of history seemed to hang in the balance. In the years that followed, the story of Midway would be woven into the fabric of the Pacific War, a symbol of resilience, courage, and destiny. It was a battle that showed not just the skill of American pilots and sailors, but the will of a nation that refused to be defeated. Historians and veterans, both American and Japanese, would look back on the battle at Midway as the moment when fate itself seemed to hold its breath. It was the precise moment when the fury of Japanese expansion came face to face with the resilience of the United States, and the outcome was no longer a question of how long the Americans could endure, but of how quickly Japan could be pushed back. It was a battle where strategy, intelligence, and bravery converged to change the tide of war, but it was also a battle of chance, where the unfolding events were shaped by serendipity as much as by skill. For many, the parallels between Pearl Harbor and Midway were striking. The shock and humiliation of December 7, 1941, had reverberated through the United States, shaking the confidence of the American people and military. The attack had been a blow that had seemed to cripple the Pacific Fleet, leaving the U.S. in a vulnerable position. But from that moment of defeat came the determination to rise, to fight not only for survival but for the redemption of the nation. In the span of just 6 months, Midway would come to symbolize America's rebirth, the moment when the United States proved it was not a nation to be broken, but one that could rise from the ashes. Veterans of the battle, both American and Japanese, would speak of Midway not only as a military engagement but as a defining moment in their lives. For those who fought in the battle, it was a test of everything they had, their courage, their training, their belief in victory. But it was also a moment where fate seemed to stand still, where human struggle became so finely balanced that the outcome could have tipped in either direction. The survivors, who would live to recount the battle for years to come, often described it as a moment where history itself seemed suspended. It was as though the battle was part of a larger narrative, one where the decisions of a few men, in the face of overwhelming odds, determined the future of an entire nation. For the American commanders and their subordinates, Midway was the realization of what they had long believed, that intelligence and courage were as vital as firepower in the modern age of warfare. Admiral Nimitz, who had come to command the Pacific Fleet under daunting circumstances, would reflect on the victory with both humility and pride. He was keenly aware that the victory at Midway was the result of factors far beyond his control, from the cryptanalysis that had exposed Japan's plans to the bravery of the American pilots who had flown their final missions with the weight of history on their shoulders. The victory at Midway was not his alone, but the result of a collective effort by all branches of the military, each playing its part. The Japanese commanders, too, would reflect on the battle with a mixture of pride and regret. The shock of defeat at Midway reverberated through the Imperial Navy, and its effects would linger long after the battle was over. Admiral Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Japan's early successes, would privately admit that Midway had been the beginning of the end for Japan's plans in the Pacific. Despite his tactical brilliance, he had underestimated the resolve of the Americans. Yamamoto had woken a sleeping giant, and now the giant had begun to fight back with all its might. The psychological impact of Midway would be felt on both sides. For the Americans, it was the moment when fear turned to confidence, when survival became victory. For the Japanese, it was a moment when their confidence turned to doubt, and the illusion of invincibility began to crumble. Midway was not just a battle between fleets, it was a battle for morale, for the hearts and minds of the people, and for the psychological advantage that would shape the next phase of the war. As time passed, Midway would be etched in history as the moment when destiny was revealed through human struggle. It was a turning point, but it was also a reminder of the fragility of fate. In the chaos of battle, where lives are lost in an instant and plans unravel in moments, victory and defeat often hinge on the smallest of decisions: a dive bomber's aim, a pilot's courage, the intelligence intercepted at just the right time. These were the elements that shaped history. And Midway stood as a monument to all that had been achieved and lost in that battle. In the years after the war, historians would look back on Midway as the defining moment that set the course for the Allied victory in the Pacific. It was the first major shift in a war that had seemed unwinnable, and it provided the momentum for the island-hopping campaign that would eventually bring the Allied forces to Japan's doorstep. But for those who fought at Midway, the victory was more than just strategic. It was a moment where history itself seemed to hold its breath, where the fate of the Pacific, and the fate of the world, hung in the balance. The echoes of Midway reverberated through the halls of the Imperial Navy and beyond, bringing with them a wave of shock, disbelief, and a sense of unavoidable doom. The once proud and seemingly invincible naval force that had swept across the Pacific just months before now lay shattered. 4 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been sunk in a single day, along with their experienced aircrews. The loss was not just a tactical defeat, it was a strategic catastrophe, one that would cripple Japan's ability to project power across the Pacific and set the stage for its eventual downfall. The heart of Japan's air power, the very pilots who had led the charge in their earlier victories, were lost forever. These men, who had once brought death and destruction to the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, were now scattered in the sea or burned in the sky. Their replacement was not something that could be quickly achieved. The elite pilots who had learned their craft through years of experience could not be replaced by recruits and unseasoned airmen. Japan's training programs and reserve forces were already stretched thin by the expanding scope of the war, and the loss of their best pilots would leave a gaping hole in their ability to continue the fight. The devastation of their aircrews could not be understated. These were the men who had taken the fight to the Americans and the Allied forces. Without them, Japan's ability to launch coordinated strikes against the United States was severely diminished. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had once commanded the Japanese Navy with absolute authority, was now faced with the weight of his own failure. His brilliant strategic mind, which had led Japan through early triumphs, now found itself up against an enemy that was far more resilient and adaptive than he had anticipated. Yamamoto's reputation, built on the bold and decisive actions that had brought Japan to the forefront of naval power, now felt like a distant echo of the past. Midway had not only shattered his fleet but had also destroyed the myth of the invincible Imperial Navy, a myth that had been constructed over years of unparalleled military success. Now, Yamamoto was forced onto the defensive, grappling with the fact that his vision of Japan's dominion over the Pacific was no longer a reality. The fateful battle had exposed Japan's vulnerability, and the Americans, once reeling from the attack on Pearl Harbor, now held the initiative. Yamamoto's forces, once the undisputed masters of the sea, now had to retreat, regroup, and attempt to salvage what little remained of their strength. The balance of power had irreversibly shifted, and Japan's previous confidence in its military superiority had been shattered. As the Japanese Navy began to retreat, there was a deep, unspoken realization among the higher ranks of the Imperial Command: the empire was beginning to rot from within. The cost of ambition had begun to weigh too heavily on the empire's shoulders. The men who had once been so confident in their ability to sustain Japan's aggressive expansion were now dealing with the harsh realities of a war that was no longer under their control. Japan's reach was no longer limitless, its resources, once flowing freely, were now increasingly scarce. The ability to maintain their far-flung garrisons, supply lines, and fleets was becoming more and more difficult, as the Allies continued to chip away at their territories. Japan's once proud navy, built on the idea of imperial dominance, now faced a crushing inevitability. It was clear that Japan's earlier successes had been fueled by momentum, by the belief that their naval superiority would carry them to victory. But now, that momentum had been broken. The loss of Midway had revealed the cracks in their strategy, and with each passing day, the scale of their vulnerability became more apparent. The killing blow at Midway was only the beginning. Japan's imperial ambitions would continue for some time, but the days of unchecked expansion were gone. The loss at Midway had set the stage for a long and grinding war, one that would ultimately drain Japan's strength and expose its military weaknesses. The myth of the invincible navy was destroyed, and now the empire was left trying to reconcile with the reality of a war it could no longer win. The Japanese leadership, once so confident, now found itself trapped in the consequences of its overreach. For Yamamoto, there was no easy escape from this reality. His plans had faltered, and now he was left with the task of slowing the inevitable. His retreat into quiet isolation was a reflection of the increasing sense of despair within the Japanese military leadership. He knew that his country's position in the war was growing weaker by the day, and he could no longer hold to the belief that Japan's military dominance would return. The battle for the Pacific was no longer about quick, decisive victories. It had become a long, drawn-out struggle for survival. With the victory at Midway now etched in history, the United States Navy and Marine Corps began their determined push across the Pacific, carrying with them the momentum of that pivotal battle. Midway had been the turning point, the foundation upon which the Allies could now build. The victory was not just a momentary success, it was the spark that would ignite the American island-hopping campaign, where each strategic step forward would bring the U.S. closer to Japan's homeland. The tide of the Pacific War had shifted. The ocean, which had once belonged to Japan, was now filled with the hum of American carriers, signaling a new era of naval warfare. The American offensive took its first major step with the capture of Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, a key island that held vital strategic importance due to its proximity to Japanese supply lines. The Japanese had built an airfield there, and controlling it would give the Americans a foothold to push northward toward Japan's outer perimeter. The battle for Guadalcanal, beginning in August 1942, would be a grueling and bloody struggle, but the U.S. was no longer fighting just to hold the line. They were fighting to advance, to push Japan into retreat. The U.S. Navy's success at Midway had proven that aircraft carriers, not battleships, were now the key to naval dominance. Armed with torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighter aircraft, the carriers allowed the Americans to project power across vast distances, striking at Japan's forces from hundreds of miles away. The importance of air superiority, intelligence, and coordinated attacks became doctrine in every subsequent battle. The lessons learned at Midway, that timing, intelligence, and adaptability were just as important as sheer firepower, guided every move the U.S. military made as they advanced further into the Pacific. By the end of 1942, the Solomons and the Gilbert Islands had become major theaters of operation. The Marines and U.S. Navy fought side by side to take strategic islands like Tarawa and Bougainville, securing airfields and naval bases that would serve as stepping stones for the final push toward Japan. Each victory, though hard-won, brought the Japanese Empire closer to its breaking point. The once sprawling Japanese defense perimeter was crumbling, island by island, as the Americans moved ever closer to the Philippines, and then to the home islands themselves. For the Japanese, the loss of territory was now becoming irreversible. Once an empire that stretched across vast swaths of the Pacific, the Japanese were now unable to stop the American momentum. Their fleets, weakened and fractured after Midway, could not keep pace with the U.S. carriers that continued to strike at their defenses. Japan's reliance on battleships and fixed defenses left them vulnerable to the speed and flexibility of the American airstrikes. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, emboldened by their success at Midway, now moved forward with the confidence of a nation that could no longer be defeated. The Pacific Ocean, once a vast Japanese stronghold, was now a contested battlefield, with American carriers striking where and when they chose. The seas were filled with the constant hum of engines, the sound of planes flying off carrier decks, the signature of the new American war machine. It was no longer a battle for survival. Now, it was a battle for total dominance. Every island captured was a victory that brought the American offensive closer to Japan's homeland. The landings on Guadalcanal, the victory in the Solomons, and the capture of the Gilberts were just the beginning. The Southeast Pacific was about to become an American stage for the final, decisive battles that would leave Japan's ability to continue the war in ruins. Decades after the Battle of Midway, the story of the great naval clash began to settle not only in the history books, but in the silent depths of the Pacific. As the years passed, the wrecks of the Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, lay forgotten beneath the waves, preserved in the darkness. The ocean, vast and indifferent, had claimed them, their once glorious hulls now twisted and broken, resting on the seabed like silent tombstones marking the final resting place of thousands. Post-war divers and historians would eventually venture to these sunken ships, bringing with them the curiosity and reverence that comes with the passage of time. Armed with modern diving technology, they explored the wrecks of Midway with the respect and awe that the battle, and the men who had fought there, deserved. The war was over, and yet, these sites would become sacred ground, preserved in the silence of the deep. The ships, now rusted and covered by marine life, told a story not only of a battle, but of the men who had given everything in pursuit of a vision. The ocean floor became a cemetery, one that was visited not only by American divers but by Japanese descendants as well. These were the final resting places of fathers, sons, and brothers, men who had fought for opposing dreams, but who had shared the same fate. For the Americans, the loss was personal, marked by the sacrifice of pilots and sailors who had given their lives at Midway. For the Japanese, the losses were no less tragic. Their pilots, too, had flown into battle knowing the odds of survival were slim. The wrecks beneath the waves were a reminder of the high cost of war, where the lines of enemy and comrade blurred in the face of shared humanity. For the divers who ventured to these wrecks, the experience was one of reverent stillness. They would find artifacts, airplanes, and remains of the men who had once filled these ships, each discovery a piece of a larger story. Some of the wrecks were so well preserved that it felt as though time had frozen in the moment of their destruction. The planes, their wings still bearing the marks of battle, appeared as though they had just flown into the fray. The Akagi's flight deck, the Kaga's bomb bays, and the Hiryu's aircraft storage became tombs where the past lived on. The remains of these ships did not only reflect the violence of battle, they reflected the shared humanity of all those who had fought in the war. These men, whether Japanese or American, had once been soldiers of pride, pilots of duty, and sailors of belief. They had taken to the skies and the seas believing that what they fought for was just and worth sacrificing their lives for. But in the end, all that remained were the wrecks beneath the waves, silent markers of the tragedy of war. The ocean, with its ability to preserve and conceal, became a guardian of history. The wrecks of the carriers were not just forgotten relics of a battle, they were living memories, reminders of what had been lost in pursuit of ideals. As divers carefully explored the wrecks, their respectful silence echoed a larger message, that the history of Midway, and the men who fought there, should never be forgotten. The wrecks of the carriers were eventually designated as protected sites, ensuring that these sunken ships would remain undisturbed by future generations. Yet, they were visited often, by descendants, historians, and veterans who sought to understand the true cost of the battle and to pay homage to those who had been lost. The sea had claimed its price, but it also kept their stories preserved, beneath the waves, in the darkness. The legacy of Midway, therefore, was not just one of military strategy or national pride. It was a legacy of human sacrifice, of individuals who had fought for the future of their nations, who had died in pursuit of ideals that they believed were worth everything. And as the ocean preserved their memories, it became clear that, despite the decades that had passed, the ghosts beneath the waves still told their story, not as enemies, but as fellow human beings who had shared in the great struggle that shaped the world. As the years rolled on, the Battle of Midway transitioned from the realm of history into the realm of legend. In the aftermath of the conflict, the battle would not only be remembered as a pivotal moment in the Pacific War, but it would come to symbolize something greater, a story of redemption, resilience, and the indomitable spirit of a nation that had once been knocked to its knees but rose to strike with unmatched courage. In the United States, Midway became more than a military engagement. It became America's story of redemption after Pearl Harbor, the moment when the nation, once humiliated and uncertain, had demonstrated that it could no longer be held back. For the American public, Midway was proof that defeat did not define them, that no matter how great the loss, no matter how unexpected the attack, the United States could and would recover. The shock of Pearl Harbor was now in the rearview, replaced by the fury and skill shown at Midway. The battle was memorialized in films, books, and documentaries, where it became a symbol of American resilience in the face of adversity. Post-war films, like Midway, 1976, and Tora, 1970, would tell the story of the battle, portraying the American pilots' heroism as they fought against overwhelming odds, guided by the principles of courage and intelligence. These films, while dramatized, would serve to immortalize the heroism of Midway, turning it into a mythic moment in the national consciousness. Midway was also commemorated in the many memorials dedicated to those who fought and died. Monuments were erected, plaques were placed, and statues were unveiled to honor the pilots, sailors, and soldiers who had given their lives in the battle. The USS Midway, a carrier that would go on to serve in later conflicts, was decommissioned and turned into a museum in San Diego, where it continues to stand as a living tribute to those who fought and died there. Over time, Midway transformed from a military victory to a national symbol, a place where the American spirit was tested and where it had, ultimately, triumphed. For those who lived to witness it, it was a moment that would never be forgotten, a chapter of history that would be replayed in memories, films, and conversations for generations. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japan's remembrance of Midway was steeped in tragedy and caution. The loss of its fleet carriers marked the beginning of Japan's shift from victory to retreat. Midway was remembered as a profound warning, a symbol of the cost of arrogance, the price of overconfidence in the face of an enemy that had more resolve than Japan had anticipated. The defeat shook the Japanese military leadership to its core. It was a reminder of their miscalculations, their failure to understand the will of the American people, and the resilience of a country that had been dealt a crushing blow at Pearl Harbor yet refused to yield. Midway, in many ways, would forever haunt Japan's leaders. For a nation that had seen so much success so quickly, Midway was a stark reminder of the danger in underestimating your adversary. The myth of Japanese invincibility, so carefully constructed, crumbled at Midway's waves, and with it, a new realization emerged: the war would no longer be easily won. As time passed, veterans' voices began to fade from public view. The men who had fought at Midway, once young and hopeful, were now aging, their bodies tired by years of life and war. Yet, through the archives, their voices remained eternal. In recorded interviews, written accounts, and memoirs, they told their stories, the sacrifice, the fear, the comradeship, stories of ordinary men who had become part of an extraordinary moment in history. In the fading pages of time, their voices still called out from the past, reminding future generations of the courage it took to face the unimaginable, and the resolve it took to turn the tide of war. In the end, the battle for Midway would forever be remembered as more than a military operation. It was a story of transformation, a moment in history when the course of the Pacific War changed, and with it, the fate of nations. For America, it was the turning point, the beginning of its offensive, and the moment that proved its strength and resilience. For Japan, it was a bitter lesson, the end of the age of unchecked conquest, and the beginning of the slow, relentless march toward defeat. The battle for Midway would never truly fade. It became a legend, woven into the fabric of history, a myth that transcended time and war. It was a story of courage, sacrifice, and hope, a story that would be told over and over, in every generation, until the last voice of a veteran had been silenced. Decades after the Battle of Midway, the Pacific Ocean still held the secrets of that day, the ghosts of men who had fought and died for their countries, their ideals, and their dreams. Though the Pacific War had moved on, and the world had shifted into a post-war reality, the battle's echoes remained. The historians, the veterans, and the survivors of Midway would spend the rest of their lives reflecting on that pivotal moment in time, wondering, was Midway won by brilliance, or was it the product of chance? The answer, as with all great battles, lies somewhere between strategy and fate, between human will and the unpredictable forces of history. In the quiet reflection of time, Midway's true lesson becomes evident. It was never just about tactics or naval maneuvers. It was about something deeper, something beyond military strategy. Midway illustrated the limits of ambition, the fragility of hubris, and the relentless power of courage in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. In those fleeting moments, when bombs fell and planes dove toward their targets, the true cost of war became all too clear. Lives were not just lost, they were sacrificed in pursuit of an ideal. It was a lesson about the price of victory, the cost of empire, and the frail line between domination and destruction. Midway, along with Stalingrad and El Alamein, marked the turning points that broke the age of empires. The world, shaped by imperial ambitions for centuries, began to fracture under the weight of new, rising powers. Midway represented the last gasps of one empire's attempt to expand, and the first steps of another, previously wounded empire, moving toward global leadership. The defeat at Midway shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility, and it opened the door for the United States to take its place as the dominant force in the Pacific and beyond. The Japanese Navy, which had once ruled the waves, was now forced onto the defensive, and the Allied advance could begin in earnest. For the men who had fought there, and for the nations involved, Midway would remain a symbol, not just of military brilliance, but of the costs of ambition and the price of pride. The victory at Midway had shifted the balance of the war, but it had also revealed the deep human cost beneath that success. The sailors, the pilots, and the commanders who participated in the battle would carry the weight of the loss, not just of ships and planes, but of comrades, of dreams, and of the very idea of invincibility. Though the Pacific may now be calm, the memories of those who fought at Midway live on beneath the waves. The wrecks of the carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, still lie at the ocean's bottom, their metal bodies entwined with the marine life that now calls the wreckage home. The ocean, indifferent to the humans who once sailed and fought above it, remains a witness, a timeless recorder of humanity's greatest triumphs and its darkest follies. The sea remembers the men who fought for empire, for freedom, for pride, and for survival. The men who died at Midway, and the survivors who lived to tell the tale, are now part of the fabric of history. Their faces, once youthful and filled with hope, have faded into the past. But the memory of their actions, the sacrifices they made, and the decisions they faced in the chaos of war are preserved, not just in history books, but in the deep, still waters of the Pacific. Midway, as a chapter of the war, has settled into the memories of those who were there, and into the hearts of nations whose histories were shaped by its outcome. In the decades that follow, the survivors' voices, though growing quieter, continue to tell the story of Midway. The sailors and pilots who lived through that battle would pass their memories to new generations, ensuring that the lessons learned in that defining moment would not be forgotten. But even as the men fade into memory, the ocean remains, eternal, indifferent, and forever holding the ghosts of those who shaped the world.